was the person Charles trusted most in the world during this time, had reportedly told him that Camilla was not the right material for a future princess. The palace had a view, never stated explicitly, but clearly communicated through the institutional atmosphere that surrounded Charles wherever he went, that his eventual wife would need to meet a set of criteria that Camilla, who had already been involved with Andrew Parker Bowles by the time she began seeing Charles, did not fully satisfy. There was also, in Charles's character, a quality of delay that ran through his decision-making, at all the points in his life where commitment was required, an ability to be genuinely connected to something, and to still not act on it, to defer, to extend the present, to avoid bringing matters to the point where they required a permanent form. He did not ask Camilla to wait for him. He did not make any arrangement that secured the connection across the months that were coming. In November of 1972, he joined HMS Minerva for a tour of duty with the Royal Navy that would take him away from England and from Camilla. He went to sea. In his absence, Camilla Shand accepted Andrew Parker Bowles's proposal. The speed of events from that point, Camilla and Parker Bowles became engaged in early 1973, and the wedding took place on July 7, 1973, at the Guards' Chapel in Wellington Barracks. The ceremony was attended by a significant gathering of the military and county social world that both families occupied. The Queen Mother was present. The regiment was represented with appropriate ceremony. Charles was at sea. The accounts of how Charles received this news vary in their specifics but not in their substance. Dimbleby's biography, drawing on Charles's own journals, describes a devastation that was genuine and significant. Charles wrote about what he felt with a directness that the management of his public life almost never permitted him. The journals from this period have not been published, but Dimbleby had access to them, and the account he gives of Charles's response to Camilla's marriage is not the account of someone who had been casually involved with someone who had then moved on. It is the account of someone who had lost something he understood, at the moment of losing it, to have been the real thing. He was 24 years old. He was at sea on a naval vessel. He was the heir to the throne of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of 15 other realms and territories, and the woman he loved had married someone else while he was away. And in the way that the palace's management of Charles's life had always operated, the loss was a private thing that could not be publicly named, could not be formally acknowledged, could not be processed through any of the mechanisms that other 24-year-olds use when they lose someone they love. He could not grieve publicly. He could not call the grief what it was. He carried it forward. He carried it forward into the years that followed, into the search that the press and the palace, and eventually the whole country, began watching with the particular hunger that the British public has always had for the marriage of the heir to the throne. The specific nature of what Charles found in Camilla, and why it proved impossible to find an equivalent of it elsewhere, is a question that the biographers who have spent the most time with the subject have grappled with in different ways. Jonathan Dimbleby, who had more direct access to Charles's own account of his inner life than any previous biographer, describes the relationship in terms that Charles himself apparently used. A connection that felt natural, in a way that the management requirements of his existence made very little else feel. The word natural carries a specific weight in Charles's context. His life had been, from the earliest age, organized around the requirements of an institution, the clothes he wore, the schools he attended, the events he appeared at, the manner in which he was expected to conduct himself at those events, the relationships he was allowed to acknowledge, and the ones that required management. All of it was organized by a structure he had not designed and could not modify. In that context, the experience of something that felt natural, that did not require the management layer between him and the world, was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that people who have access to it in ordinary life take for granted, and that people who do not tend to recognize with a clarity and an intensity that those who have it can underestimate. Camilla was also, by the accounts of people who spent time in her company across the years of this story, someone who did not change her manner in Charles's presence. This is rarer than it sounds among people who find themselves in sustained proximity to the heir to the British throne. The gravitational pull of the institution produces a specific deference in most people, sometimes visible and sometimes not, that alters the quality of the interaction. Camilla was not deferential. She treated Charles with the warmth and the directness that she apparently brought to most of her relationships, and the straightforwardness of this, the experience of being treated as an ordinary person, rather than a position, was something that Charles had almost no access to anywhere else in his life. Whether the relationship would have had the same qualities if it had been formalized earlier, if Charles had asked her to wait, or if the palace had supported the connection, is a question that the story as it actually unfolded does not give us the information to answer. What the story does give us is the pattern of what happened, that the relationship, denied and suppressed and externally disrupted, acquired over decades of denial and suppression and disruption, a specific intensity and a specific permanence that the most straightforwardly conducted relationship might or might not have developed. The cost and the length of the story between them are part of what the story became. There is something in the character of what Charles and Camilla were to each other that explains, without justifying, why the affair continued through 17 years of his marriage, rather than ending when the marriage began. The explanation is not that Charles was without conscience, or that he was indifferent to the cost. The explanation that emerges from the biographical record is that the connection with Camilla was the one thing in his carefully structured and institutionally managed life that was genuinely his, in a way that nothing that had been assigned to him was his. He could not make himself give it up. The marriage to Diana had been chosen by the institution, by the palace's calculations about suitability and timing, and the need for the heir to produce a succession. The relationship with Camilla was the choice he had made. Andrew Parker Bowles occupied a position in this story that has received less examination than the positions of the other principals, partly because he chose not to write his account, and partly because his character, which was by all accounts that of a man with considerable personal confidence and a settled relationship with his world, did not produce the kind of publicly visible distress that generates biographical interest. He had been part of Camilla's social world before Charles appeared in it. He had, by the accounts of people who moved in the same circles, conducted his own marriage, with a pragmatism that was consistent with the conventions of the world they both inhabited. The specific and notable complexity is that Andrew Parker Bowles had himself been in a romantic connection with Princess Anne in the early 1970s, before and during the period of his relationship with Camilla. The connection with Anne had not been formalized and had been managed, in the way of the specific social world they all occupied, without the kind of collision that the same situation would have produced in a less contained social environment. Andrew Parker Bowles moved through his world with the ease of someone who understood its rules and applied them without difficulty. Whether he knew, across the 22 years of his marriage to Camilla, the full extent of her continued connection with Charles is a question that nobody has been positioned to answer on the record. He has been asked versions of it in various interviews over the years, and has declined to answer in the specific form that the question takes when journalists ask it directly. His divorce from Camilla in 1995 was uncontested and was managed with the dignity that the word managed implies, when people who have known each other well for a long time and who have children together and who will continue to move in the same social world conclude a marriage. He subsequently married Rosemary Pittman in 1997 and has remained largely outside the public sphere of the Charles and Camilla story since. The years between 1973 and 1980 are documented in the public record, primarily through the tabloid press's sustained and increasingly frantic coverage of Charles's romantic life. The coverage was not, by the standards of later royal journalism, particularly aggressive. The specific conventions of 1970s British press culture around the royal family still involved a degree of deference that the next decade had not yet eroded. But the basic activity of identifying which young women Charles was spending time with, speculating about which of them might become Princess of Wales, and then reporting on the ending of each connection with varying degrees of sympathy for the parties involved, was well established by the time Charles returned from sea service and began the decade in earnest. The list of women who appeared in this coverage is long and has been catalogued extensively by the biographers who have covered this period. Lady Jane Wellesley, daughter of the Duke of Wellington, was considered the most likely prospect for a period in 1973 and 1974. She was attractive, from an impeccably appropriate aristocratic family, intelligent, and had nothing in her background that the palace could point to as a complication. The connection did not develop into an engagement, and the accounts of why not are consistent with a story that will recur across the women in this decade. Jane Wellesley, by the accounts of people who knew both her and Charles during this period, was not sufficiently interested in becoming Princess of Wales to accept the life that the title entailed. She understood what was being offered, and she calculated that what was required was more than she wanted to give. This was a calculation that several of the women in Charles's social world made during the 1970s, and it is worth dwelling on what the calculation involved, because the fact that multiple women made it illuminates something about the nature of the institution they were being asked to enter. What was being offered was not simply the position of wife to the most eligible bachelor in the United Kingdom. What was being offered was the complete dissolution of private life, the permanent submission to the institutional requirements of the palace, the management of every statement and every appearance and every friendship by an institution whose interests were its own. The women who declined were not turning down Charles, they were turning down what Charles came attached to, which was a different thing and a considerably larger one. Davina Sheffield was another name in the coverage of the mid-70s. She was photographed with Charles at polo events and at country house weekends, and the press ran its usual speculation with its usual diligence. The relationship encountered the press itself as one of its primary obstacles. When a former boyfriend of Davina's gave an interview to a tabloid about their relationship, the palace's implicit calculation of what was acceptable in a potential future Princess of Wales produced the outcome that multiple accounts describe as the effective end of the connection. Charles did not manage this calculation. It was managed for him, by the atmosphere and by the institutional signals that were as clear as any explicit instruction would have been. Lady Sarah Spencer was briefly associated with Charles's name in the 1977 coverage. She was the eldest daughter of Earl Spencer and the older sister of a 16-year-old girl named Diana, who was present at Althorpe in November of that year when Charles came for a shooting weekend. Lady Sarah's connection with Charles was acknowledged by both parties in later years as having been a friendship rather than a serious romantic prospect, and Sarah has spoken at various points about the specific qualities of Charles that she found attractive, and also about the qualities that made her understand, clearly and early, that marrying him was not something she wanted to do. The Duke of Edinburgh weighed in sometime in this period, in a way that has been documented by multiple sources. Philip wrote to Charles. The existence of the letter has been confirmed by Dimbleby, among others, and in it, he made the argument that Charles's behavior with women he had no intention of marrying was damaging to the women involved, to the institution, and to Charles's own reputation. He urged Charles to make a decision. The letter was characteristically direct. Philip's communications were always characteristically direct. Whether they had the effect Philip intended is debatable, but they contributed to the pressure that was building on all sides by the time Charles reached his early 30s. The world was watching, and the world was beginning to be impatient. Into this pressure, in 1979 and into 1980, came Anna Wallis. She was 25 when Charles began spending serious time with her. Her full name was Anna Louise Wallis, and she was the daughter of Hamish Wallis, a Scottish landowner with estates in Perthshire. She had grown up with horses and the countryside, and the specific confidence of someone who had been raised in a world where what mattered was what you could do and how you conducted yourself, and where the gap between genuine quality and performed quality was understood by everyone in the room. She hunted with a boldness that had earned her a nickname in the relevant social circles, Whiplash Wallis. The nickname was meant as a compliment. She was good on a horse, and she was fearless about it, and in the world she moved through, that was a form of credibility that no amount of social positioning could manufacture. She was not easily impressed. This is the quality that comes through consistently in the accounts of people who knew her during this period. She had the self-possession of someone who has decided who she is and what she will and will not accept, and who sees no reason to revise that decision in response to the status of the person asking her to. She found Charles interesting. She was genuinely connected to him during the time they spent together. She was also, from the beginning, clear that the version of the connection that required her to accept his other entanglement was not a version she was going to accept. The other entanglement was not named publicly during the period of her relationship with Charles, but within the social world that both of them occupied, within the circles that moved through the polo grounds and the country houses of Gloucestershire and Wiltshire and the surrounding counties, The entanglement was understood. Camilla Parker Bowles, who was now Camilla Parker Bowles of Bowlerhyde Manor in Wiltshire, who was married to Andrew Parker Bowles, and who was the mother of 2 children, was also the woman who was present in the specific way of a person who has a claim that no official structure acknowledges. The relationship between Charles and Anna Wallis developed seriously enough in 1979 and into 1980 that it was covered in the press as the most probable answer to the marriage question. Sources in the social world around both of them described a genuine connection, a warmth, a quality of mutual interest that was more developed than the tabloid shorthand of eligible woman meets eligible prince had any vocabulary to convey. People who watched them together thought it was real. And then there was a polo ball in Cirencester. The Cirencester Park Polo Club ball took place in the summer of 1980, and both Charles and Anna Wallis attended, as did Camilla Parker Bowles. The specific events of that evening have been described in multiple accounts, with varying degrees of detail, but with consistent agreement on the essential shape of what happened. Charles spent the evening in a way that made Camilla Parker Bowles the center of his attention. He danced with her, he spent time with her. He neglected Anna Wallis in the specific way that is not neglect by accident, the way that is a choice made by someone who has decided, in the moment, that the other claim is the one that matters. Anna Wallis watched. She was not a woman who would misread what she was watching, and she was not a woman who would ignore it, because the person responsible for it was the heir to the throne. She cornered Charles at some point during the evening, by the accounts that exist from this period, and she said, in words that have been reported in various forms in various biographies, that no one treated her like that, and that this principle applied to everyone, including him. She left. She did not come back to the relationship. The connection was over. It ended Charles's last serious relationship before Diana Spencer. He was 31 years old. The palace's patience was running out. The press's patience was running out. The Duke of Edinburgh's patience had long since run out, and in the summer of 1980, the young woman who would become Diana Spencer had begun to attract Charles's attention at the country house events that formed the social calendar of their shared world. Diana Frances Spencer was born on the 1st of July 1961 at Park House on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. Her father was Edward John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, who would later become the 8th Earl Spencer. Her mother was Frances Ruth Burke Roche, who was herself the daughter of the 4th Baron Fermoy. The family's connection to the royal family was long established. Frances Roche's mother Ruth, Lady Fermoy, was a close friend and lady-in-waiting of the Queen Mother, and the Spencer family had been connected to the Windsors for generations in the specific way of the upper stratum of the English aristocracy, through proximity, through shared social worlds, through the geography of great houses. Diana was the third of 4 children, and from the account she gave of her childhood in the tapes recorded for Andrew Morton in 1991, the dominant fact of that childhood was the departure of her mother. Frances Spencer left the marriage in 1967, when Diana was 6 years old. The separation and subsequent divorce involved a custody battle that Frances lost, largely because her own mother Ruth Lady Fermoy testified against her, in what Diana described later as one of the most consequential betrayals in a family that had several. Frances eventually married the wallpaper heir Peter Shand Kidd and moved to Scotland. Diana remained with her father at Park House and later at Althorp. She saw her mother. She maintained a relationship with both parents across the years of childhood, which is to say she was shaped by the specific difficulty of loving 2 people who had separated in bitterness and who occupied worlds that did not overlap, except through the inconvenient fact of having produced children who moved between them. The wound this produced in Diana has been analyzed extensively, and in some cases overanalyzed, in the sense that analytical frameworks applied retrospectively to childhood events can flatten the complexity of how those events are actually experienced by the children who live through them. What can be said without oversimplifying is that Diana carried from this period a specific and heightened sensitivity to the signs of imminent departure in the people she was closest to, a vigilance, not always conscious but always active, for the signals that the person she needed was about to choose to go somewhere else. She went to school at Westheath in Kent, where she was, by her own later admission, not an academic child. She took her O-levels and did not pass them well enough to proceed to A-levels. She was good at swimming and at dancing, the dancing being something she pursued with genuine commitment and a physical talent that her teachers and later observers consistently noted. She had, from early in her life, the quality that she became famous for in her public work as an adult, an ability to make people feel that she was genuinely interested in them and what they were going through, which was different from the performed attention that most public figures provide, and which most people, given enough time with her, could tell was the real thing. She moved to London when she was 16, eventually to a flat in Coleherne Court, in Earl's Court, that she shared with 3 friends, and she took a job at a nursery school in Pimlico, the Young England kindergarten. She worked with the children with the specific patience and warmth that the children and their parents noticed and remembered. She was 16 when she first encountered Charles, at Althorpe in November 1977, when Charles came for a shooting weekend, and Diana was there as a schoolgirl in her own family's house. He was 29. She was, by the accounts of people who were present, shy in the way that a 16-year-old is shy in the presence of someone around whom the atmosphere of significance has always been visible. He noticed her in the passing way that a 29-year-old notices a 16-year-old sibling of a former girlfriend. There was nothing in this first encounter that the people present identified as significant at the time. The reconnection happened in the summer of 1980, at the agricultural show in Sandringham, and at subsequent country house events through that summer. Charles had begun to notice Diana in a different way. She was 18, then 19. She was cheerful, easy to talk to, undemanding. She had the quality of someone who was genuinely pleased to be in his company, who found him interesting, and was not trying to position herself as the answer to a question she'd heard he was trying to solve. That last quality is worth pausing on, because it was almost certainly part of what attracted Charles. The women who had preceded Diana in the press speculation, and in Charles's actual attention, had each had the specific self-knowledge to assess clearly what the offer of marriage to Charles entailed, and to make a calculated decision based on that assessment. Diana, at 19, did not have that kind of self-knowledge, partly because she was 19, and partly because the information available to her about what the life being offered actually looked like was incomplete, in ways she did not know were incomplete. She thought she knew. She had grown up in the orbit of the royal family. She had been to events. She had been around the apparatus. She did not know what she did not know. Charles's interest developed across the autumn of 1980. He invited her to events. She went to Balmoral. She impressed the people around Charles in ways that the people around Charles, who had spent years watching the candidates for his eventual marriage pass through, were looking for. She did not seem frightened. She did not seem calculating. She seemed, genuinely, to like him and to be comfortable in the world she was being shown. The palace's assessment of her suitability was swift and positive. She was from an aristocratic family with royal connections. She was English. She was young, and the specific cruelty of the institution's assessment of its future queens, which was never stated aloud but was always present in the calculus, was that young meant shapeable, young meant no prior attachments that the press could mine, young meant she could be molded into what the institution required. The press had found her by September of 1980, which in the climate of British tabloid coverage at that time meant that the choice had effectively been made public before Charles had formally made it. The press coverage created its own pressure. The naming of Diana as the likely future Princess of Wales in print, repeatedly, in the major newspapers, made the non-selection of Diana, after a certain point, a different kind of decision, not merely a personal decision about a romantic connection, but a public decision that would require managing. Charles proposed on February 6, 1981, at Windsor Castle. He had been advised to offer Diana time to consider before answering. She said yes immediately. She was 19 years old. She loved him, or loved the version of him she understood at that point, which was necessarily partial, because the full version of him was not something that 19 years of ordinary life in Chelsea and Pimlico had equipped her to read. What happened in the weeks between the proposal and the wedding is documented in the tapes Diana made for Andrew Morton a decade later, and in the accounts of people who were around her during that period. The picture they produce is of a young woman who moved from the joy of the announcement into a growing awareness of the dimensions of what she had agreed to, and of the specific obstacle inside the arrangement that she had not fully understood when she said yes. The obstacle had a name, and the obstacle wore a gold bracelet. Charles had commissioned the bracelet sometime in the weeks before or immediately after the engagement. It was gold, with a blue enamel disc, and it was engraved with the letters G and F, Gladys and Fred. The pet names that Charles and Camilla had used for each other, private names that had no currency outside the specific and intimate world of what they were to each other. The specific mechanisms by which the palace managed Diana across the years of her marriage have been described in bits and pieces by various accounts, and have not, in any single source, been fully assembled into the coherent picture that the accumulated evidence suggests. What emerges from the Morton tapes, from Paul Burrell's memoir, from the accounts of people who worked in Diana's household and who have given interviews over the years, and from the biographical work of writers who have had access to multiple sources, is a picture of an institution dealing with a problem that it had not anticipated and did not have the right tools for. The problem, from the palace's perspective, was this. Diana was enormously popular in a way that the institution had not produced and could not control. The public had connected with her through the specific quality of her presence in hospital rooms and hospices, and at the events of the charities she worked with. The connection was not produced by the palace's communications machinery. It was not the result of managed coverage or strategic positioning. It was the genuine response of people who encountered, in their princess, something that felt real. This made Diana simultaneously an asset and a risk. As an asset, her popularity gave the institution a public face that was more loved than any it had had in decades, possibly ever. As a risk, her popularity was not the institution's to manage or direct, or to remove if necessary, because it did not belong to the institution. It belonged to Diana. The palace's response to this situation evolved across the years of the marriage and was not consistent in its methods, though it was consistent in its underlying priority, which was the management of the institutional reputation rather than the support of the individual member. Diana has described the experience of going to palace officials with accounts of her mental health difficulties and receiving responses that focused on managing the public appearance of her state rather than on addressing the state itself. She described being told that she needed to compose herself before public appearances, which was an institutional requirement, rather than being asked what she was experiencing in a way that might have opened toward actual support. The specific people to whom she spoke and the specific conversations she had have been described with varying levels of detail in the sources. What is consistent is the outcome. Diana felt unheard, felt managed, felt that the institution's primary interest in her was as a component of the public-facing machinery, rather than as a person whose well-being mattered independently of what she could deliver for the institution's purposes. Whether this perception was accurate in every case is a question that the institutional perspective, which has never been as fully articulated as Diana's perspective, cannot fully answer. What can be said is that the perception was the product of sustained experience rather than a single misunderstanding, and that the sustained experience left marks. The bulimia was real and was severe and had begun, by Diana's account, in the first year of the marriage. It was an eating disorder in the specific clinical sense, the restriction and the purging and the binge cycles that characterize bulimia nervosa, not merely an unhealthy relationship with food, but a psychological condition with serious physical consequences. She said in the Morton tapes that at her worst, she was vomiting several times a day. She said that Charles's response when she disclosed this was inadequate, that he did not respond in the way she had needed him to respond, though what she needed him to do, and why she felt that he had not done it, are questions that the Morton account, which is necessarily one-sided, provides only her side of. The self-harm was also real. She described, in the tapes and in the Panorama interview, incidents in which she had cut herself, and in which she had understood the cutting as an expression of an inner pain that had no other route out. She described the relief the physical pain provided, briefly, from the psychological pain that surrounded it. She said the palace's response to evidence of these episodes was to manage the situation rather than to address what was causing it. She was also followed, not in the surveillance sense exactly, but in the specific sense of an institution that tracks the movements and activities of its members with the completeness that institutional security requires, and that, in Diana's experience, felt not like protection, but like monitoring. The protection officers whose job it was to keep her safe were also, by the nature of the role, sources of information about her activities that reached people in the palace whose interest in her activities was not primarily protective. She managed her life within these constraints with the specific creativity of someone who is determined to find space that the management has not reached. The friendships she maintained carefully with people outside the institution were partly about affection and partly about the specific need for conversations that could not be monitored, relationships where she could be herself without the institutional frame. Paul Burrell, who became her butler in the late 1980s and who remained in her service until her death, has described the role he occupied in her life in terms that suggest something between professional service and personal loyalty, of a kind that the specific isolation of Diana's situation produced. She trusted a small number of people with a depth that was proportional to the degree to which she was unable to trust the institution that housed her. Burrell was one of them. Her private secretary, Patrick Jepson, was another, though his eventual account of their working relationship, published in 2000, describes a relationship of considerable complexity in which his loyalty and her instincts were not always aligned. The accounts of people who knew Diana during the later years of the marriage and the years following the formal separation are consistent on one thing. She was not, by the time the Morton book brought the full picture into public view, in any sense, the naive 19-year-old who had walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. She had spent 11 years inside an institution that she had come to understand with the specific completeness of someone who has paid careful attention for long enough to see through the surface. She understood the management. She understood the communication strategies. She understood what the palace's priorities were and how her own role fitted into those priorities. She had also developed, across those 11 years, a public presence and a media relationship of her own that the palace could not fully control, because it had not produced it and could not take it away. The specific journalists and photographers who had covered her since 1981 had developed relationships with her that were not managed by the palace press office and that gave her access to coverage that she could use for her own purposes, when her own purposes required coverage. This made her, by the early 1990s, a different kind of problem for the institution than she had been in 1981. She was no longer manageable in the ways she had been manageable at the beginning. She had resources the palace hadn't anticipated and connections the palace couldn't access. The Morton book was the most significant deployment of those resources, but it was not the only one, and the Panorama interview was a further deployment that demonstrated, in the clearest possible terms, that the management had limits she was willing and able to exceed. He intended to give it to Camilla before the wedding, a parting gift, the explanation ran, a gesture to mark the end of a chapter. Diana found out about the bracelet. The route by which she found out has been described in various accounts with varying specifics, but the outcome was that she knew about it before Charles gave it to Camilla, and she confronted him about it. He confirmed what it was and explained it in the terms described above. She tried to accept the explanation. She thought about ending the engagement, and in the tapes for Morton, she describes talking to her sisters Sarah and Jane about calling the whole thing off. Her sister's response, as Diana recalled it, was this: "Your face is on the tea towels." It was not said with cruelty. It was an acknowledgement of the practical reality of a situation that had moved beyond the point where withdrawal was simple. The press had been writing about the engagement for weeks. The public had embraced Diana. The merchandise had been manufactured. The machine had been set in motion. And the machine of a royal wedding, once it achieves sufficient momentum, has a mass that individuals find very difficult to redirect. She did not call it off. She went to the pre-wedding lunch, which brought together the people closest to Charles, and she sat at the table, and she saw Camilla Parker Bowles wearing the bracelet. She watched Charles. He did not meet her eyes. She was 3 weeks from the wedding, and she was sitting across a table from the woman who was wearing the parting gift that was supposed to mark the end of the chapter, and the chapter was not ended, because the bracelet that was supposed to signify the end was on the wrist of the person who was sitting here, at this table, in this specific arrangement. Diana looked at Charles. He looked somewhere else. She went through with it. The wedding of Charles, Prince of Wales, and Lady Diana Spencer, on the 29th of July, 1981, was held at St. Paul's Cathedral, rather than Westminster Abbey. a departure from the more recent convention of royal weddings that was explained publicly in terms of the cathedral's greater capacity to accommodate the scale of a state occasion of this significance. The guest list was 3,500 people. The service was broadcast to 650 million television viewers worldwide. Along the route from Buckingham Palace to the cathedral, 250,000 people stood in the streets despite the summer heat. The dress was designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel and was made from ivory silk taffeta trimmed with antique Carrick-Macross lace. The train was 25 feet long and arrived into the cathedral in a state that required careful attention from the 5 bridesmaids tasked with managing it, because the silk had crumpled in the glass coach on the way to the ceremony, and Diana walked up the aisle, wearing the memory of the journey as well as the dress. The photographers caught the crumpling in enough detail that it would be discussed for years afterward, and the discussion always concluded in the same place. It made her look human, which was precisely the quality that the palace's management of the day had been designed to suppress. Archbishop of Canterbury Robert Runcie performed the service and delivered an address that included the observation that this was the stuff of which fairy tales are made. He was a thoughtful man who chose his words carefully, and the phrase carried more than one reading even at the moment he said it, though the reading that most of the 3,500 people in the cathedral and the 650 million people watching on television received was the celebratory one. Diana stumbled over the order of Charles's Christian names during the vows, calling him Philip Charles Arthur George rather than Charles Philip Arthur George. Charles stumbled over his own vow about worldly goods. These were the mistakes of nervous people in a moment of enormous pressure, and they were received by commentators worldwide with the warmth of people who were glad to find something recognizably human in the ceremony. They were not read as omens. Nobody reads things as omens at the time. The honeymoon began aboard the royal yacht Britannia, which sailed from Gibraltar through the Mediterranean. By Diana's own account, recorded for Morton, the honeymoon was not what she had hoped it would be. The specific word she used was lonely. Charles read books. He wrote in his journals. He was, in Diana's description, present in the physical sense but absent in the sense that she had needed him to be present. He was kind. He was not unkind. He was the version of himself that was available to him given the formation he'd had, which was a version that moved through close proximity with emotional need in the specific way of someone who has been taught that emotional need is something the people around you are expected to manage, rather than something you are expected to meet. The honeymoon continued to Balmoral, the royal estate in Aberdeenshire, where the family spent the summer, and it was at Balmoral, or on the Britannia in the Mediterranean, that Diana found what she found. In Charles's journal, pressed between its pages and visible when the journal was open, there were photographs of Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana found them. She said nothing. She placed the journal back where it had been. She carried this forward into the rest of the honeymoon and into the first months of her marriage, with the specific composure of someone who has decided that acknowledging what she knows will make things worse rather than better, and who therefore keeps the knowledge inside her like something she cannot put down. The marriage had barely started, and she was already carrying the weight of it. Highgrove House sits in Gloucestershire, 3 miles from the market town of Tetbury, on land that Charles had purchased in 1980 with money from the Duchy of Cornwall. The house itself is Georgian, built around 1796, with 9 bedrooms and the kind of proportions that suggest a family of country means, rather than the ceremonial grandeur of the palaces Charles had grown up in. What it had was what the palaces did not have: privacy, or the closest approximation to privacy that the heir to the throne could achieve in the British landscape of the 1980s, which was not very close, but was closer than anything else available. Around the house, Charles built something that became the public project of his private life: a garden and farm managed according to the organic principles he had become, ahead of most public figures, and well ahead of public fashion, genuinely committed to. He was involved in every decision. He planted and planned and consulted, and was physically present in the garden, in ways that the people who worked there remembered clearly, because the level of his engagement was not what you expected from someone whose schedule was organized by a private secretary, and who had 868 royal engagements in his first year as Prince of Wales. At Highgrove he was a different person. More present, more patient, easier. Highgrove was 12 miles from Bowlerhyde Manor in Wiltshire. Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla Parker Bowles lived at Bowlerhyde Manor. It was their family home, the house where their children Tom and Laura grew up, a manor house in the Wiltshire village of Allington, with the specific character of an English country house that has been properly lived in for long enough to feel like the people in it belong there. Andrew Parker Bowles was a cavalry officer of distinction, eventually rising to the rank of brigadier, a man who moved through the military and social worlds of the English establishment with the ease of someone born into them, and who had never had cause to question whether he belonged. He was charming, good company, well-connected. The 12 miles between Bowlerhyde Manor and Highgrove was drivable in under half an hour. Camilla Parker Bowles hunted with the Beaufort Hunt, which is based in Badminton in Gloucestershire, 12 miles from Tetbury, which put her on the same grounds and at the same meets as the world that centred on Highgrove. The Duke of Beaufort, who was the master of the hunt, was part of Charles's social world. The Beaufort Hunt was one of the most prestigious in England and had been ridden by members of the royal family for generations. The specific social world that the Beaufort Hunt anchored, the houses and the weekends and the dinners that formed its supporting structure, was a world in which Camilla Parker Bowles was a fixture, and in which Charles, given where he had chosen to live, was also a fixture. The proximity was not accidental and was not unnoticed by Diana. Diana moved to Highgrove as part of the marriage. She had not chosen Highgrove, had not been involved in its purchase, had arrived at a house that was already established as Charles's place, in the way that any house becomes its occupant's place, through the accumulated choices of the person who lives there. The garden was Charles's project, and Charles's vocabulary. The social world around it was Charles's world. The people who came to dinner and for weekends were people Charles had known for years, people whose relationships with him predated Diana, and whose connection to the world around Highgrove was established. Among those people was Camilla Parker Bowles. She came to dinner at Highgrove. She was part of the circle. This was presented to Diana, and to anyone who might have asked about it, as the natural consequence of living in a county where the social world was small and interconnected, and where excluding someone from the social life of a house, based on their prior relationship with the host, would have been both practically difficult and socially awkward. Camilla was a friend. Andrew Parker Bowles was Charles's friend. They were neighbours, within the definition of neighbourhood that applies to the Gloucestershire gentry, where 12 miles is a reasonable drive to dinner. There was nothing odd about their presence in the social life of Highgrove. This was the official version. Diana did not believe it, and was not wrong not to believe it. The protection officers who drove Charles to his engagements, and who were responsible for his security at all times, who sat in cars outside houses, and who knew where Charles went and when, understood what was happening in the way that people who are employed as silent observers of another person's movements will always, over time, understand what they are observing. They maintained the specific professional silence of their role. Their job was the security of their principal, not the management of his marriages, and the institutional culture of royal protection made clear, in the way that institutional cultures make things clear without stating them, that the silent observation was what they were employed for, and that anything beyond silent observation was not. The private secretaries who managed Charles's schedule, who arranged appointments and kept calendars, and processed the logistics of a life that operated at the intersection of official duties and private life, made the accommodations that schedules require. When Charles was at Highgrove and Camilla was in the neighbourhood, and arrangements were made that included both of them, in ways that required calendar management, the calendar was managed. The specifics of what went on a calendar and what didn't, what went through official channels and what was handled informally, were understood by everyone who worked in the office, with the completeness of people who have been doing this kind of work long enough to have developed the relevant professional fluency. The household staff at Highgrove operated with the understanding that is produced by being continuously present in a domestic space, while the domestic life of that space unfolds around you. They understood the patterns. They understood what calls came, and from whom. They understood who arrived and when, and what the atmosphere of the house was before and after certain arrivals. This understanding was not articulated among themselves in ways that would have produced a coherent institutional account. It was the distributed knowledge of a household, carried individually by the people who worked in it. Diana was attempting to build a home in a space that had already been organized, at every level, from the geography of the county to the social architecture of the weekends, to the logistical management of Charles's schedule around the presence of another woman. She was also, across the first years of the marriage, trying to become what the institution required of her, which was a different, and in some ways harder task. The public appearances were managed with the precision that the palace applied to all its important public work. The wardrobe was managed, initially not to Diana's taste, and eventually according to a collaboration between Diana's own developing style and the advisors the palace provided. The official engagements multiplied: hospital visits, charity patronages, overseas tours, the specific schedule of a working member of the royal family who had become, almost immediately after the wedding, one of the most photographed people in the world. Diana was extraordinarily good at the public work. This is documented not just in the press coverage of the period, but in the first-hand accounts of the people she visited and the charities she worked with. She had a quality of genuine attention that people receiving it from a Princess of Wales had not expected to find, because the expectation, formed by long acquaintance with formal royal visits, conducted according to a script of handshakes and polite inquiries, was not of genuine attention, but of managed attention. Diana's attention was not managed. She sat on the edge of beds in hospitals and held the hands of people who were dying, and listened in a way that the people she listened to remembered for the rest of their lives as the time someone had really paid attention. William Arthur Philip Louis was born on the 21st of June 1982 at St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington. Diana described the birth in the Morton tapes as a moment of genuine happiness, the kind of happiness that came from something that was really hers, a child who needed her and who she would provide for in ways that no institutional management could intercept. Charles was present. His response was warm and was the subject of a comment about the baby's hair coloring that Diana recalled as the first evidence of a disappointment she hadn't expected. Henry Charles Albert David was born on the 15th of September 1984. Harry's birth arrived during what Diana later described as one of the better periods of the marriage, a period of relative equilibrium, temporary rather than permanent. She had wanted a daughter. Charles, by Diana's account, said something at Harry's birth about the hair color, about the red in it, in a tone that Diana understood as ambivalent. The marriage by the mid-1980s was operating as two projects that shared a house, two children, and a public schedule. Charles had the Duchy of Cornwall, the Highgrove Garden, the architecture campaigns, the organic farming interests, the environmental work, the polo. He had a full and absorbing interior life, in which Diana was, if she was present at all, peripheral. Diana had the children, the charity work, the public appearances, and the specific and increasingly claustrophobic world of Kensington Palace, where she moved through days structured by the institutional management of a member of the royal family, in a way that she experienced, with increasing frequency, as constraint rather than support. She was also, by the mid-80s, aware with a certainty that required no further confirmation, though she did receive further confirmation, of what was happening at Highgrove when she wasn't there. By Jonathan Dimbleby's account, drawing on Charles's own cooperation with the biography, the relationship with Camilla had resumed in a physical sense by around 1986. Dimbleby frames this as following the irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. Whether the marriage had irretrievably broken down by 1986, what that phrase means in a marriage between two people who are constitutionally unable to divorce without the monarch's consent, and who are continuing to produce public appearances of a marriage for the 365 days of every year, is a question that the available evidence does not easily answer. What can be said is that the friendship between Charles and Camilla, which had never stopped, had deepened and extended through the years since the wedding, and through the proximity that Highgrove made structural and inevitable. Whether the relationship had been physical in any period between Camilla's marriage in 1973 and the mid-80s is a question that neither party has definitively addressed, and that the available record cannot settle. The emotional intimacy had clearly continued. The contact had clearly continued. The specific ease that Camilla produced in Charles had clearly remained available to him in ways that nothing about his marriage to Diana had replicated. The people who worked closely with Charles and Camilla during the Highgrove years of the 80s have described, in accounts that have emerged gradually through interviews and memoirs, the specific texture of an arrangement that everyone around it understood and that nobody named. They did not name it because naming it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have required responding to it, and responding to it would have disrupted an institutional arrangement that the palace had decided was preferable to the alternatives, which included the public acknowledgement of the situation, which was unthinkable, or the management of Charles's private life in a way that removed Camilla from it, which everyone who understood Charles understood was also unthinkable, for different reasons. The palace, as an institution, made a specific and sustained choice during this period. The choice was to manage the situation rather than address it. The management operated through the silence of the protection officers and the discretion of the private secretaries and the professional culture of the household staff and the institutional deference of the press, which in the mid-1980s still observed enough of the conventions of the previous era to avoid printing what it knew or strongly suspected. The press knew, or strongly suspected. Journalists who covered the royal family during this period have since been clear that the outlines of the Charles and Camilla relationship were understood within the press corps well before any of it appeared in print. The legal risk and the social convention and the residual institutional deference that prevented publication in the 1980s is a chapter in the history of British media culture that has been written about extensively in the decades since. What matters here is the outcome. The public did not know, could not know, because the system that existed to produce and distribute that knowledge was not yet functioning in the way it would function by the early 1990s. Diana knew. She knew in the specific and complete way of someone who is paying attention to a situation that directly concerns her, and who has been paying attention long enough to have accumulated evidence well beyond the level that required for certainty. The specific moment she identified as the point of full and inescapable knowledge was the phone call. She was at Kensington Palace, in the residence they shared in the palace's south wing. She was in her mid-20s. She went to pick up an extension of the telephone, possibly to make a call, or possibly because she had been alerted to the presence of a call that was already in progress. The accounts vary on this specific detail. What she found when she picked up the receiver was the voice of her husband speaking to another person in a register she had never heard him use with her. The call was not to Camilla's home telephone. It was to a private number, a number that Charles had arranged to be able to call Camilla outside the normal channels of a household, in which calls were logged and managed by staff. Diana listened long enough to understand with complete certainty what she was hearing and what the nature of the relationship between the two voices was, and then she placed the receiver back quietly. She did not announce herself. She did not interrupt the call. She did not confront Charles when he came off the telephone. She carried the knowledge forward. What she did with it over the following years is the core of the story that eventually reached the public. But before that story is told, it is worth dwelling for a moment on the specific quality of what Diana was doing when she didn't confront Charles, because the not confronting is sometimes misread as passivity or as uncertainty about what she had heard. It was neither. It was the calculated behavior of someone who understood clearly that she was alone in her situation, in the most complete sense, that the institution around her was organized to deny the reality she was living, and that a direct confrontation of Charles would produce a denial delivered with the complete confidence of a man with enormous institutional support for the version of reality he chose to present. Diana understood, at 23 or 24 years old, that the confrontation would leave her in exactly the same position she was already in, except that she would have tipped her hand and given Charles and the palace the opportunity to manage the consequences. She was not passive, she was strategic, in a way that took years to fully reveal itself. She also talked, not to the palace and not to people who would have felt obligated to report what she said to the palace, but to people she trusted, a small and carefully selected group that included her friend Caroline Bartholomew, who would later be one of the people who confirmed to Andrew Morton that Diana had cooperated with the book, and other women who moved in the same world and who had demonstrated, by the specific fact of being in Diana's confidence at all, that they could be trusted with what she told them. She also tried, in the period from the mid-80s onward, to get help through the official channels that were technically available to her. She spoke to palace officials about her unhappiness. She spoke to people in the medical and psychological support structures that the palace operated. The response she received was not, by her account, the response of people who understood the urgency and the severity of what she was describing. It was the response of an institution that was primarily interested in managing the public performance of its members, and that had a limited capacity to engage with the private reality of what those members were experiencing when the private reality conflicted with the management requirements. She developed bulimia, which she described in the Morton tapes as an expression of the specific psychological pressure she was under. The food and the vomiting were something she could control in a life that felt entirely uncontrolled. She described the palace's response to this as inadequate. She described showing Charles the evidence of it and his response as insufficient. She also cut herself. She described incidents in the Morton tapes in which she had used sharp objects against her own skin, incidents that she characterized as a response to the specific and helpless quality of a pain that had no other outlet in her circumstances. The palace's response to this was also, by her account, inadequate, which was the word she used carefully because it was the most honest word available, without becoming accusations she could not sustain. She was the Princess of Wales. She was one of the most watched people in the world. She was in a marriage that the institution around her had decided to protect as an image, regardless of what it actually was, and she was alone with what she knew, in a way that is difficult to describe, and that she spent the tapes with Morton, trying to describe with the kind of directness that the specific freedom of speaking into a tape recorder in a private room with no other person present allowed her to use. Andrew Morton found his way into this story through the connections he had built over years of covering the royal family, and through his understanding of the gap between the official picture and the reality underneath it. He was a journalist with a record, had written about the royals with more accuracy than most, and had developed relationships with people in Diana's orbit who were able to tell him that the official picture was not merely incomplete, but wrong, in ways that mattered. He made contact through intermediaries. The approach was careful, because the stakes of getting it wrong were serious on multiple levels. Diana's position was such that any cooperation with a journalist that became known to the palace before the work was completed would produce institutional consequences that the palace was fully equipped to implement, and that would include the withdrawal of access, the termination of certain professional relationships, and the full deployment of the palace's communications machinery to preemptively discredit what was coming. The arrangement that was reached was this. Morton would prepare questions, recorded on cassette tape, and pass them to an intermediary who would bring them to Diana. Diana would record her answers in her home, alone with a tape recorder, and pass the tapes back through the same route. The answers would form the foundation of a book that would be attributed to sources close to Diana, maintaining enough ambiguity about the sourcing to give Diana a measure of deniability if it became necessary. The tapes were recorded in 1991, in a series of sessions that produced several hours of Diana speaking about her marriage, her mental health, her experience inside the institution, and her knowledge of Charles and Camilla. She spoke with a directness that was not edited by the presence of an interlocutor or the awareness of being on camera. She spoke into the recorder in the voice of someone who had decided to tell the truth about her experience, and who had calculated, correctly, that the protection of anonymity through the deniable sourcing was worth the price of not being able to claim the account publicly. In the tapes she described the bracelet. She described the photographs in Charles's journal aboard Britannia. She described the phone call she had heard. She described the institution's failure to help her with what she was going through. She named what had happened to her with a specificity and a consistency that made the subsequent claim by the palace that the accounts in the book were unreliable essentially impossible to sustain, because specificity of that kind is not produced by fabrication. Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story, was published on the 9th of June, 1992. It was published by Michael O'Mara Books in London, and the print run sold out within days of its release. By the end of its first week, it had gone to multiple reprints and had achieved the specific velocity that books achieve when they are covering something the public had been waiting to know that it had not known how much it needed to know until the book arrived and told it. The palace's initial response was to question the sourcing. Statements were made or implied by palace officials and picked up by journalists who reported them faithfully, that the book's claims about Diana's mental health and unhappiness were unreliable, that the account of the marriage bore no resemblance to the reality known to people inside the institution, and that Morton's sources were of dubious quality and credibility. This response was the standard palace communications response to unwelcome coverage, and it operated, in the first days after publication, with the efficiency that standard responses achieve when the system deploying them is well practiced. Then a complication arrived. Several of the people named in the book as Diana's close friends gave interviews confirming that they had spoken to Morton and that what the book attributed to them was accurate. Caroline Bartholomew, who had been Diana's flatmate at Coleherne Court before the marriage and who remained one of her closest friends, went further than most, going on record in a way that confirmed both her involvement in Morton's reporting and the essential truth of what the book described. She was photographed with Diana outside Caroline's house around the time of the book's publication, in a meeting that was interpreted, with considerable accuracy, as a public signal. The palace had no mechanism for managing the testimony of private individuals who were confirming their involvement in something that the palace had said was unreliable. The standard communications tools, the controlled briefings and the managed access and the institutional weight of the Crown as a source, are effective against journalism that depends on anonymous sources and can be discredited through questions about methodology. They are far less effective against people who are willing to put their names to what they say and who have the specific credibility of people who were actually there. The book held. The palace could not dislodge it, and the reading public of Britain in the summer of 1992 began the process of reassessing everything they had believed about the Wales marriage and about the two people in it. Charles did not respond publicly in any direct way. There was no statement from him and no authorized rebuttal. The palace as an institution maintained its position that the account was unreliable while being unable to name specifically what was wrong with it. This created an interesting epistemic situation for the British press. A book that the palace said was untrue, written by a journalist with a credible track record, attributing its content to sources who were in several cases willing to be named, about events inside a marriage that the palace had no intention of addressing transparently. Diana's family, or some members of it, initially supported the palace position. Her brother Charles Spencer made public statements suggesting that the picture of Diana painted by the book was not accurate. These statements, given the specific nature of what the book described, were not easy to sustain, and they were quietly retired as the weeks passed and the book's accounts became more, rather than less plausible in the public's estimation. The isolation Diana experienced after the book's publication was significant. Within the royal family, relationships that had been formerly correct, if not warm, became cooler. The people in the palace's orbit who had been uncertain about how to position themselves in relation to Diana, which is the position most people in institutional proximity to a crisis adopt while the crisis is still resolving its shape, moved toward the institutional position. Diana had cooperated with a journalist. She had permitted accounts of the royal family's private life to appear in print. This was an act that the institutional culture regarded as a fundamental betrayal, not of Charles specifically, but of the institution, and the institutional response was accordingly institutional. Diana was effectively alone inside the structure in which she was being managed, which was what she had been before the book and which was now formalized rather than merely experienced. That summer, something else surfaced. In August of 1992, the Australian magazine New Idea published a portion of a transcript of a private telephone conversation between a man whose voice was identified as Charles, Prince of Wales, and a woman identified as Camilla Parker Bowles. The conversation had been recorded on the 18th of December 1989, intercepted by an amateur radio enthusiast, James Gilby, who had been scanning frequencies with equipment that could pick up mobile telephone signals in an era before encryption was standard in commercial mobile phones. The tape had existed since December 1989. It had circulated in certain parts of the British press for approximately 2.5 years before the Australian publication. The reason it had not appeared in British print before this point is a chapter in the history of press and institutional relations that is worth dwelling on briefly, because the delay is itself a piece of evidence about how the management had been working and what its limits were. The British tabloid press of the 1980s operated under a combination of legal constraints and informal conventions that produced a culture of what might be called selective disclosure. Certain things that were known to editors and reporters were not published, not because of legal prohibition in every case, but because of a combination of factors. the possibility of legal action from Buckingham Palace, the residual social convention that treated the private lives of the royal family as a category of information that required exceptional justification for publication, and the specific relationships between newspaper proprietors and the establishment that made aggressive coverage of the heir to the throne a decision with social as well as legal consequences. This culture was already eroding by the early 1990s. The Morton Books publication, in June 1992, had accelerated the erosion in a specific way. It had demonstrated that accounts of the royal family's private life could be published and could not be effectively rebutted, which changed the calculation for editors who had previously decided that the risk of publishing outweighed the benefit. The Australian publication changed the calculation further. Once the content of the Camillagate tape had appeared in print in Australia, it could not be treated as entirely unpublishable in Britain. The material was available. The American tabloid The National Enquirer published it in November. The question for British editors was when, not whether. The People published the full transcript on the 13th of January 1993, a Sunday morning. The decision to publish was a commercial decision, and an editorial decision, and a decision about what the British public in 1993 had a right to know. It produced a news event. The conversation the transcript captured was approximately 11 minutes long. It covered the practicalities of when Charles and Camilla would next be able to see each other. It contained expressions of physical longing that left no ambiguity about the nature of the relationship. It contained references to the frustrations of their respective domestic situations and to the people in those situations, including, implicitly, Diana. And it contained the passage that became the one quoted in every subsequent reference to the tape, in which Charles expressed a wish to be reincarnated as a particular object that would allow for permanent physical proximity to Camilla. The passage was reproduced in newspapers across the world. The cartoonists had at it. The comedians had at it. The degree of dignity loss that the passage represented for the heir to the British throne was substantial and immediate, and had a quality of permanence, because once something like that is in the public record, it is in the public record, and the management of the heir's image had to be rebuilt from a position that had shifted in a way that could not be fully corrected. The effect on Camilla Parker Bowles was different, but no less significant. She had been a known but not widely named figure in the public discussion of the Wales marriage before this point. After the tapes, she was a person whose name was known to every person in Britain, whose face appeared in every newspaper, whose role in the events of the previous 20 years was now understood, at least in outline, by the public that had been watching those events without knowing the full picture. She did not speak publicly. She issued no statements. She did not give interviews. She went through the days following the tape's publication with the composure of someone who has been trained by a lifetime in a social world that prizes the maintenance of appearance above most other considerations. The hostility directed at her was real and visible in the public discourse of the time, and she carried it with the specific bearing of someone who has decided that the only available option is to continue. The formal separation of Charles and Diana was announced on the 9th of December, 1992, by Prime Minister John Major at the dispatch box in the House of Commons. The date matters slightly. It came after the Morton book had appeared in June, and before the Camillagate transcript had appeared in British print in January 1993, which placed it in a window of considerable institutional pressure and considerable public appetite for the official version of events to catch up with the unofficial one. Major stated that the Prince and Princess of Wales had decided to separate, and that the separation had been reached amicably and with the best interests of the princes as its primary consideration. He confirmed that it involved no change in the constitutional position of the Princess of Wales and constituted no obstacle to the prince's eventual succession. He asked the House to note that no change was required to the constitutional position and that the prince would continue to be heir to the throne. The statement contained the word amicable, which was the most strained part of it, given what was actually known about the state of the marriage by December 1992. But it was the word that the palace required to be used, and that the Prime Minister used accordingly. The separation meant, in practical terms, that Charles and Diana organized their public schedules independently, maintained separate residences at Kensington Palace, and ceased to be publicly required to perform the functions of a married couple in the ways that royal marriages generate public performance. It also meant that the question of what came next was now openly in the public domain, in a way it had not been when the marriage was officially intact. In January of 1995, Camilla Parker Bowles and Andrew Parker Bowles were divorced. The divorce proceedings were uncontested. The grounds were stated in the legal form that applies to divorces in which both parties have accepted the irretrievability of the marriage. The Parker Bowles marriage had lasted 22 years and had produced 2 children, Tom and Laura. The press coverage of the divorce was not extensive because by January of 1995, the information that the Parker Bowles marriage was ending was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention to the coverage of the preceding 3 years. Andrew Parker Bowles subsequently remarried and went on with his life with the specific equanimity of someone who had always understood the arrangement and who, having moved beyond it, found other things. Camilla was now free. The palace was aware that she was free, and that the fact of her being free would be read, by the press and by the public, as a step on a road that had a known destination. The management of this awareness was a piece of institutional communications work that Charles's office had been doing for some time and would continue to do for the next decade. Jonathan Dimbleby's biography of Charles was published in October of 1994. Its arrival had been preceded by a documentary broadcast on ITV on the 29th of June 1994, in which Charles sat with Dimbleby and addressed, in the specific way of someone who has been very carefully prepared for an interview, the questions that the public had been waiting for the institution to address. The documentary addressed Camilla directly. Charles was asked whether he had been faithful in his marriage. His answer, delivered with the careful pacing of someone who knows the weight of each word before he speaks it, was, yes, he had been faithful, until the marriage had irretrievably broken down. The hedge contained in that phrase, the implicit claim that the breakdown preceded whatever followed, was a piece of framing that Dimbleby's biography expanded on in greater detail. In the book, Charles's account had the affair resuming after the marriage had effectively ended as a real marriage, after both parties had retreated to separate emotional lives, after the breakdown was complete. This framing placed the moral responsibility for what followed on the marriage's failure, rather than on Charles's choice to pursue the relationship while married. The public received this framing with a divided response. Some people found it convincing, or at least understood the argument being made. Others, particularly those who had watched the marriage from the outside and who had formed strong attachments to Diana as a figure, were not persuaded. The Camillagate tape, recorded in December 1989, placed Charles and Camilla in an intimate phone conversation that was, by any reasonable reading, not a conversation between two people who had just resumed contact after the irretrievable breakdown of his marriage. The timeline did not resolve cleanly, regardless of the framing. If you have stayed with this story this far, we want to take a moment to thank you. Documentaries of this length and this depth take real time and care to research and produce, and we are only able to continue doing this work because of the people who watch and subscribe and share these videos. If this account is worth your time, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next. Now back to the story. The biography and the documentary together represented the most significant communications operation Charles's office had undertaken in the period of the marriage's collapse. They were designed to give Charles's account of events the record permanence that Dimbleby's authorship and access to Charles's journals could provide. They were also designed to shift the public's understanding of Charles from the person whose phone calls had been published in The People in January to someone whose complexity and whose genuine commitment to the institution he served could be understood in fuller context. The operation partially succeeded and partially did not. What it succeeded in doing was giving the media a framework, Charles's own framework, for understanding the marriage's failure that journalists could use. What it did not succeed in doing was making Diana less sympathetic or less credible, because Diana had not given her account yet in the specific form in which she would give it, and when she gave it, the effect on public opinion was decisive. On the 20th of November 1995, the BBC broadcast an interview with Diana on its current affairs programme Panorama. The interview was conducted by Martin Bashir, who had approached Diana through her brother Charles Spencer and had persuaded her of his suitability as the vehicle for what she wanted to say. The interview had been recorded and edited. The palace learned of its existence before broadcast, but could not prevent it from airing. Approximately 23 million people watched the broadcast on a Monday evening in Britain. It was the largest television audience the BBC had recorded, since records for specific programs had begun to be systematically kept. The Queen's response to the Panorama interview deserves more attention than it typically receives in accounts of this period. The standard narrative positions the Queen as having been caught off guard by Diana's interview, and as having responded by sending letters urging a swift divorce. This is accurate as far as it goes. What it does not convey is the specific quality of the decision the Queen made when she made it, and what it cost her, and what it reflected about her reading of the situation by the autumn of 1995. The Queen had been managing the Wales marriage problem since at least the Morton Books publication in 1992, and arguably since the early years of the marriage, when the signs of its fundamental difficulties had first become visible to people in the institution. She had managed it with the specific approach that was her approach to most difficult situations, the belief that time and patience and the maintenance of outward form would allow events to take their own course, and that intervention, particularly intervention that required making a visible choice between the parties, was a tool to be used only when there was no alternative. By November of 1995, there was no alternative. Diana had given an interview to the BBC's Panorama programme in which she had spoken about her marriage with a directness that the palace's management framework had no capacity to contain. She had addressed the question of Camilla Parker Bowles by name and by implication. She had addressed Charles's fitness to be king by suggesting that she did not believe he had the patience for the role that the position would require. She had addressed the institution's treatment of her in terms that made it clear she regarded the treatment as having been inadequate to the point of negligence. The interview was watched by 23 million people in Britain on a Monday evening. By Tuesday morning, it was being discussed on every front page and in every newsroom in every country that covered the British royal family, which was most of them. The Queen wrote to both Charles and Diana within days. Robert Lacey's account, drawing on sources close to the household, describes the letters as brief and clear, and as representing the moment when the Queen decided that the public management of the situation had to be brought to a formal conclusion, regardless of the personal and institutional costs that the conclusion would produce. The word amicable, which had been used in the December 1992 separation announcement, was available for the divorce announcement as well, in the formal legal sense. In every other sense, the situation was as far from amicable as it was possible to be. Diana received the letter and consulted her advisors. Her response to the Queen was that she would agree to a divorce if the terms were appropriate and if her public role was protected in meaningful ways. The negotiations that followed, between the legal representatives of both parties, produced the settlement announced in August 1996, the financial terms, the accommodation at Kensington Palace, the public role maintained, but independent of the palace machinery, and the removal of the HRH designation. The removal of the designation was, by the accounts of people around Diana at the time, the element she found most difficult. She understood what it meant institutionally, the formal diminishment, the statement through official channels that she was no longer fully within the family she had spent 16 years inside. She accepted it because the full terms of the settlement gave her enough of what she needed, the financial independence, the access to her sons, and the continued ability to do the public work that had become the most meaningful part of her life. She had less than a year of the new arrangement before Paris. Diana sat in a chair in Kensington Palace, with her hair loose and her eyes darkened with kohl, and spoke for over an hour about her marriage, her mental health, her experience inside the institution, and the relationship between Charles and Camilla. She was controlled and specific, and free of the managed language that official palace communications deployed. She had clearly prepared for the interview, but she had not, in the relevant sense, performed it. She was speaking in her own voice about her own experience. The sentence that became the shorthand for the entire interview, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." It was delivered without drama and without a raised voice, and without any of the emotional excess that the sentence's content might have invited. It was delivered as a fact, stated with the specific flatness of someone who has known something for a very long time, and has finally decided that there is no longer any reason not to say it in public. She also addressed the question of whether she would be queen. She said she did not think she would be in the traditional sense, and she said she thought her role was different, that she wanted to be a queen in people's hearts. This was not a statement of resignation. It was a statement of intention, a description of the role she had already been performing, without the official title, in the hospitals and the charities, and the specific moments of human connection that the public had been watching since 1981. The response from the palace was swift. The Queen, who watched the interview with the specific mixture of shock and controlled anger that characterized her responses to events that moved beyond the boundaries of what she considered manageable, wrote letters. The letter to Charles urged a swift divorce. The letter to Diana made the same point. These letters have been described by Robert Lacey in his 2020 book, Battle of Brothers, and by other sources who were in positions of proximity to the events, as representing one of the few moments in the Queen's reign when she moved with uncharacteristic speed to close a situation that had been running too long. The divorce between Charles and Diana was finalized on the 28th of August, 1996. The terms included a financial settlement of approximately £17 million in cash, the use of her apartment at Kensington Palace, the continuation of her public schedule under the auspices of her own office rather than the palace, and the retention of her title as Princess of Wales while stripping her of the designation Her Royal Highness. The removal of the HRH was experienced by Diana and understood by most observers as the palace's final institutional response to the previous years, a formal diminishment, a reduction in her official standing, an expression of institutional disapproval delivered in the specific language that institutions use for these purposes, which is the language of titles and designations rather than words. Diana accepted the settlement and the terms and moved into the next chapter of her life with the specific energy of someone who had been freed from a constraint and was not yet sure what to do with the freedom, but was determined to find out. She continued her charity work, including the landmine campaign that brought her to Angola in January 1997 and to Bosnia in August of that year. She began a relationship with Dodi Al-Fayed in the summer of 1997 and was photographed with him in the Mediterranean in a way that suggested something was possible that had not been possible for a very long time. On the 31st of August, 1997, a Sunday morning, Diana Spencer died in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. She was 36 years old. The crash killed Dodi Al-Fayed and the driver Henri Paul. The bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones survived with serious injuries. Charles was at Balmoral with his sons when the news arrived. William was 15, Harry was 12. The specific sequence of events that morning, the calls from Paris, the confirmation of injuries and then of death, the management of the boys and the decision about what to do and how to appear, and what the institution required in the hours after the heir to the throne's former wife died in a car tunnel in France, has been described in multiple accounts including William's own statements in subsequent years. Charles flew to Paris to accompany Diana's body home to Britain. He went with Diana's sisters, Jane and Sarah. The formalities were managed with the efficiency that the palace had developed over generations for the management of death, which arrives without schedule and which the institution cannot afford to be underprepared for. What the palace was genuinely underprepared for was what happened in Britain over the following week. The public's grief was enormous and was unlike anything the institution had in its framework for managing public grief. The flowers that accumulated outside Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace in the days after Diana's death exceeded any precedent in British history for spontaneous public mourning. The crowds that gathered were beyond any estimate the police or the palace had prepared for. The emotional intensity of the public's connection to Diana, which had been visible and documented for 16 years, but which had always been experienced from inside the palace as something to be channeled and managed, rather than something that might one day exceed the institution's capacity to respond to it, turned out in those specific days to be genuinely beyond the palace's management. The palace's initial response was to remain at Balmoral, in the form of private family mourning that had characterized royal deaths for generations. The flag above Buckingham Palace was not at half-mast, because the protocol for the flag at Buckingham Palace required a royal standard or no flag, and there was no protocol for flying a flag at half-mast over Buckingham Palace for a member of the family who was technically no longer a member of the family. This technical fact was experienced by the public gathered outside the palace as indifference, and the indifference was experienced as something between carelessness and cruelty. The pressure on the palace to respond, to visibly acknowledge the loss, to bring the Queen back from Balmoral, and to make the institution present in the grief that the country was expressing, was enormous, and came from every direction simultaneously. After several days, the palace adapted. The Queen returned to London. She addressed the nation in a live broadcast in which she spoke of Diana as someone she admired and respected. She walked through the flowers. She was visible. These were the institutional responses of an institution that had been caught moving too slowly and was now catching up. They were not wrong. They were late in a way that the public noticed and that the institution's management could not fully repair. Camilla Parker Bowles was not visible during any of this. She was at Ray Mill House in Wiltshire, the house she had moved to after the divorce from Andrew Parker Bowles, and she was not anywhere near the public events of the week and was not photographed. The hostility toward her that had been present in the public coverage since the Morton book and the Camillagate tapes reached a level in the aftermath of Diana's death that made any public appearance impossible. The polling from this period placed her public approval at levels that the polling organizations described as among the lowest they had measured for any public figure. She was being held responsible, in the specific and collective way that public anger tends to operate, for the circumstances of Diana's life and for the death at its end. The logic of this is not formally defensible. The car crash in Paris was the result of a drunk driver and a pursuing press pack, and a failure of the safety systems that should have been in place. But the logic of grief does not operate on the same basis as formal defensibility, and the grief of a nation for a woman they had loved for 16 years had to go somewhere, and Camilla Parker Bowles was the available place for it to go. Charles did not abandon her. The pressure from elements of the palace's internal hierarchy to distance himself from Camilla in the aftermath of Diana's death was real and was applied by people whose job it was to manage Charles's public standing and who understood clearly that his public standing could not be rebuilt while Camilla remained its visible obstacle. The argument made by these people was that the rehabilitation of Charles required a sacrifice, and that the sacrifice that the calculation pointed to was Camilla. He refused to make it. He continued to see her. He did not hold public events with her in the months after Diana's death, because the atmosphere did not permit it, and because the management of that transition required patience rather than speed. But the private reality did not change. He had decided, or had discovered through the specific test of this specific pressure, that the commitment he had made to Camilla across 25 years of a story that had cost him and the people around him more than anyone had imagined it would cost was not something that the loss of Diana's life could or should change. Whether this determination is to be admired or criticized is a question that the subsequent history has not resolved and that this account will not attempt to resolve. What can be said is that it was consistent with everything Charles had done since 1971. He had not committed to Camilla when he should have in the early 1970s. He had not been able to give up the connection when the marriage to Diana required him to. He was not going to give it up now. This consistency was the one thing about Charles's behavior in the story that was genuinely consistent throughout, and the thing that, depending on your perspective, was either a form of integrity or a form of selfishness so total that it had generated consequences he had never fully reckoned with. The rehabilitation of Camilla's public image began in the period following Diana's death and was managed with the patient deliberateness of people who understood they were working in a time frame measured in years rather than months. Mark Bolland, Charles's deputy private secretary, was the central figure in this effort and has spoken about it with unusual candor in the years since his departure from Charles's service. The strategy he describes involved the careful placement of positive coverage, the cultivation of specific journalists and editors, the gradual introduction of Camilla into public contexts in ways that were too low-key to generate concentrated hostile response, and the building of a narrative around Charles and Camilla that positioned their relationship as a committed partnership that had earned its place in the public life of the country. The strategy also involved what Bolland has called briefing against the Waleses, meaning the deliberate positioning of information unfavorable to William and Harry's households in the press during periods when positive coverage of Charles and Camilla was also appearing. This aspect of the strategy became a source of lasting damage to the relationship between Charles and his sons when it eventually became publicly known, and the knowledge of it has shaped William's and Harry's accounts of their father's office's behavior during the years after their mother's death. The first major public appearance of Charles and Camilla together after Diana's death came on the 28th of January 1999. They left a birthday party at Annabel's nightclub in Mayfair together and were photographed by the press pack that had been notified, by means that did not require public announcement, that this was going to happen. The photographs appeared on every front page the following morning. The response was not what the response would have been in September 1997. It was not uniformly hostile. Some newspapers chose warm photographs and described the couple with the language of people who had been waiting a long time for something to happen and were cautiously willing to acknowledge that it had. Some newspapers chose photographs that were more guarded and described the occasion with the neutral language of reporting rather than the charged language of editorial. The concentrated fury of the immediate post-Diana period had dissipated enough, in the 17 months since the crash in Paris, to permit a response that was more mixed and therefore more manageable. The process of public acceptance moved through the following years, with the specific pace of something being carefully managed rather than organically produced. Camilla appeared at charity events and at cultural occasions, and was covered with decreasing hostility and increasing matter-of-factness. The coverage of her shifted, not overnight but across years, from the specific register of an intrusive and unwelcome presence to the register of something like a permanent and established fact. The Queen Mother, who died on the 30th of March, 2002, at the age of 101, had been throughout this period a quiet but significant factor in the story. Her position on Camilla across the decades of the affair had been, at various points and in various contexts, one of pragmatic accommodation. Birkhall, the house on the Balmoral estate that the Queen Mother occupied as her private Scottish residence, had been used on a number of occasions as a place where Charles and Camilla could spend private time. The accounts of this come from people in proximity to the estate during the relevant periods and have been described in various forms in biographies of the period. The Queen Mother's willingness to have Camilla in her home was not a public endorsement. She was too careful and too experienced for that. But within the private world that mattered most to the people involved, it was a signal. The Queen Mother's view carried weight with the Queen, and the Queen Mother's view of what Charles's life ultimately required was, by the accounts of people who knew it, more accommodating of Camilla than the Queen's own public position on the matter. The Queen Mother's death left Clarence House vacant. Charles took it as his London residence, and Camilla moved in during 2003. This domestic fact was reported and discussed, and was understood as another step in the process that had been underway since Annabel's in 1999. Each step in the process had its own specific significance, and each step had been managed to produce the minimum available disruption to public opinion while moving the story forward. The engagement was announced on the 10th of February, 2005. Charles and Camilla would marry. The civil ceremony would take place at Windsor Guildhall on the 9th of April. The blessing would follow at St. George's Chapel. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh would attend the blessing. The Queen did not attend the civil ceremony. The explanation given was that she preferred not to attend a civil ceremony, which was consistent with convention and which was also understood by everyone involved as carrying additional meaning about the extent of her formal endorsement. She attended the blessing. This attendance was understood as the fullest endorsement available to her, while preserving the distinction between the legal formality and the religious occasion. The ceremony at Windsor Guildhall on the morning of the 9th of April, 2005, fell on the day that Pope John Paul II died, and the combination produced a news day of extraordinary complexity for editors and broadcasters who were required to cover both events simultaneously. The wedding was slightly delayed from its original date because of the coincidence of the Pope's funeral arrangements, and the adjustment produced some commentary about the management of the timing, but the ceremony itself took place in a mood that was described by the journalists present as subdued and sincere, rather than celebratory in the public, formal sense. Charles wore a mourning coat and a kilt. Camilla wore a woven silk and organza coat in pale gold ivory, designed by Robinson Valentine, with a wide-brimmed feathered hat designed by Philip Treacy. They made their vows in the registrar's presence, which gave the legal form to what had existed for 34 years, in various forms without the legal one. They moved to the castle for photographs and to St. George's Chapel for the blessing. Archbishop of Canterbury Rowan Williams conducted the blessing. In his address he acknowledged the circumstances, said that they had come to ask for God's blessing on their commitment, and said that this blessing was sought in full knowledge of the past. The formulation was honest and was measured, and was the product of a man who understood that the occasion required acknowledging the weight of what it carried, without making that weight the entirety of the ceremony. Outside the Guildhall, there were well-wishers, and there were protesters, and there were journalists, and there were photographers, and the mixture was managed by the police, with the efficiency of an institution that had considerable experience with managing the mixture of public opinion at royal events. The balance between those who had come to celebrate and those who had come to object was read by different outlets in different ways, and the reading that eventually settled into the historical record was one of cautious public acceptance rather than enthusiasm, which was precisely what the years of management had aimed for and had achieved. Camilla became, legally, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Cornwall and Princess of Wales. She did not use the title Princess of Wales. The announcement made at the time of the engagement said that she would be known as Duchess of Cornwall, and that if and when Charles became king, she would be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen. This commitment about the future title did not survive the transition to kingship. When the Queen died on the 8th of September 2022 at Balmoral, and Charles became king at the moment of her death, the palace confirmed in the days that followed that Camilla would be Queen Consort. The earlier commitment to the Princess Consort title had been superseded by a revised understanding of what was appropriate and of what the public, in 2022, would accept. The public having been living with Charles and Camilla as a couple for 17 years, and having, in that time, arrived at a relationship with her that was not enthusiasm, but was something closer to acceptance than anyone connected with her would have predicted in 1997. The days between Diana's death on the 31st of August and her funeral on the 6th of September 1997 are among the most extensively documented and most extensively analysed 9 days in British royal history, and they are worth examining in detail because the palace's management of those days reveals something about how the institution had been thinking about Diana and what her life meant to it, and because the way the institution was thinking about Diana in death was continuous with the way it had been thinking about her in life. The family remained at Balmoral. This was the decision taken in the first hours after Diana's death was confirmed, and it was a decision consistent with the royal family's established approach to bereavement, which was to treat grief as a private matter conducted in private, in the family, away from the public gaze, and to communicate to the public through the forms and conventions that institutions use when they need to manage the relationship between their private reality and their public face. The family was at Balmoral, and the boys were at Balmoral, and the view taken was that the boys needed stability and privacy, and that Balmoral provided both, and that this was the correct priority. The specific days between Diana's death on the 31st of August and her funeral on the 6th of September 1997 have been written about many times and in many forms. What has not been written about as fully is the specific experience of William and Harry during those 9 days, and the way that experience shaped their relationships with their father and with the institution in the years that followed. William was 15. He has spoken, in the years since, about the specific difficulty of the public dimension of the grief, the requirement to walk in public and to be photographed and to be seen, at 15 years old, in the middle of something that no 15-year-old has any preparation for. He has said that he found the funeral procession, the walking behind his mother's coffin, in front of the cameras of the world, one of the hardest things he has done. He did it. He was composure itself. The photographs of him walking with Harry and his grandfather, and his father and his uncle, are the photographs that most of the people who watched the coverage of those days carry with them. Harry has spoken more extensively, in his memoir Spare, published in January 2023, about the specific experience of those days and the specific failures he perceived in how the adults around him managed them. He has described being told his mother was dead in a way that felt inadequate to the weight of what was being told to him. He has described the subsequent days as a period in which the institutional requirements around him operated at a volume that his private grief could not compete with. He has described the walk in the procession as something he did not fully want to do and understood, even at 12 years old, that he had no real choice about. The effects of those days on both boys' relationships with the palace, with their father, and with the institution that had managed all of it, have been the dominant shaping force of the subsequent 27 years. William's commitment to the institution, which is genuine and which has led him to the specific form of public life he now occupies as Prince of Wales, has been built on top of and through the grief rather than in ignorance of it. Harry's departure from the institution, which is also genuine and which has led him to the specific form of public life he now occupies in California, is built on the conviction that the institution failed his mother and, in the 9 days after her death, failed him. Both responses are understandable. Both are the product of the same events, filtered through different temperaments and different subsequent experiences. The distance between them is one of the lasting costs of the story of Charles and Camilla, the cost paid not by the two people at the center of the story, but by the two people who were not in the center of it, and who paid the price of being near it. Charles's relationship with his sons in the years after Diana's death has been described in both William's and Harry's accounts, with the necessary qualification that accounts by people about their relationships with their parents are always partial. What emerges from both accounts is a father who was present and who tried, but who was also dealing with his own grief and his own institutional position and his own management of Camilla's place in the family in ways that did not always produce the kind of sustained attention to his sons' inner lives that the situation required. The specific question of when and how William and Harry were expected to accept Camilla as a part of their father's life is one that both have addressed in different ways. William made the accommodation in the specific way of someone who understood that the accommodation was necessary and who made it from a position of considered decision rather than spontaneous warmth. Harry's account suggests a more complicated process, in which his willingness to accept Camilla was partly genuine and partly performed for the sake of his relationship with his father, and partly undermined by events and behaviors he attributed to her or to her relationship with the palace press office. The Charles and Camilla story did not end on the 9th of April, 2005, or on the 6th of May, 2023. It continues in the specific form of the consequences it produced, which include, but are not limited to, the division between William and Harry, the ongoing public discussion of Diana's legacy and what the institution owed to it, and the question of how the monarchy relates to the public that watched everything happen and that carries its own account of what happened, alongside whatever the institution offers. The coronation resolved the formal question: Camilla is queen. The other questions, the ones about accountability and legacy, and the specific cost of the management choices the palace made across 30 years, remain open. They are discussed every time a new biography appears, every time William and Harry address them in different ways, every time the institution produces a public occasion that brings the whole story back into visible frame. The management continues. It has not finished. It will not finish while the principals are alive, and while Diana's sons are alive, and while the public that watched it all continues to form its own account of what it saw. What is finished, or at least what has arrived at its outward form, is the story of Charles and Camilla. It began in 1971 at a polo match. It produced consequences that reshaped the British monarchy, the British press, and the British public's understanding of what the royal family was and what it owed the people who watched it. It ended, or reached its formal resolution, at a coronation in Westminster Abbey on a cloudy morning in May 2023. The gap between those two events, the polo match and the crown, is 52 years. The management of those 52 years, the 3 decades of pretending, the machinery that ran to keep the official version separate from the private one, and the specific moment when the pretending had to stop because the story had produced consequences that no management could contain, is the story of the British monarchy in the second half of the 20th century, in its most concentrated and most consequential form. The institution survived it. The two people at its center, Charles and Camilla, survived it. The institution of the monarchy itself, which has survived rather larger challenges across its history, added this chapter to the long account of what it has been asked to contain and continued. Whether the survival is a success depends, as all such calculations do, on what you count in the accounting. The public was at the gates of Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace, and had been there since the night of the 31st. They had come in numbers that the police described as unprecedented in their experience of London crowds. They had brought flowers, enormous quantities of flowers that accumulated in drifts against the palace gates, and along the paths, and on every flat surface that the geography of the palace environs provided. They had brought cards and written messages and soft toys and candles. They had been there through the night, and through the following day, and through the day after that, and they were still there, and the numbers were growing rather than declining. The flag above Buckingham Palace was not at half-mast, because the protocols governing the flag at Buckingham Palace specified a royal standard, or the absence of any flag. There was no provision in the protocols for flying a flag at half-mast at Buckingham Palace. The protocols had been established over many years and through many deaths, and they had not been established with the expectation that the death of a woman who was no longer technically a member of the royal family, but who had been the most loved figure in British public life for 16 years, would require the institution to make a visible gesture of mourning. The absence of a flag was noticed with a depth of feeling that surprised the palace. The crowds outside the gates looked at the flagpole above the palace, saw no flag, and read the empty pole as what they experienced it as, indifference. In the specific emotional climate of the first week after Diana's death, indifference was the thing that the public found least acceptable from the institution that had been her home and her prison, and the structure through which her life had been managed, and which had, in the public's reading of the whole story, treated her badly. The press, which had spent the previous 15 years in a complicated and reciprocal relationship with Diana, in which the press needed her, and she, periodically, needed the press, was now writing about the institution in a way that combined genuine grief at her death with a long-accumulated appetite for the accountability that her story had always implied, and that the institution had always managed to avoid. The Times published an editorial, so did the Daily Mirror, so did the tabloids whose front pages had been shaped by photographs of Diana for a decade and a half. The combined message of the coverage was a demand. The institution should be present, should be visible, should be showing the country that it understood what it had lost and what the loss meant. The Queen made a decision. She came back from Balmoral to London before the funeral. She walked through the flowers outside the palace with her family, visibly, in the presence of the cameras. She gave a broadcast, live, to the country, in which she said that she spoke as a grandmother, not as a queen, about the woman she had admired and respected. She paid tribute to Diana's extraordinary gift for connecting with people and for showing compassion. These were the right things. They were late in a way that the coverage noted clearly. They were the product of an institution that had been caught moving at its institutional speed in a moment that required a different kind of speed. The palace had been managing Diana for 16 years and had become expert in the management. The management failed, in this specific week, because the thing being managed was not a situation that had a management. It was grief, national grief, of an intensity and a character that the institution had no framework for. The funeral was on the 6th of September. Diana's brother Charles Spencer delivered the eulogy at Westminster Abbey, and in it he said things that had never been said at a royal funeral before, and that the institution heard with the stillness of people who have been addressed directly about something they cannot respond to in the place where they are sitting. He described Diana's qualities. He described the cruelty of the press hunting that had been a constant of her life since 1981, and he addressed the institution in terms that were oblique enough to be deniable as a direct accusation, and clear enough that nobody in the Abbey misunderstood what he was saying. On behalf of your mother and sisters, I pledge that we, your blood family, will do all we can to continue the imaginative and loving way in which you were steering these two exceptional young men, so that their souls are not simply immersed by duty and tradition, but can sing openly as you planned. The congregation inside the Abbey began applauding. The applause spread outside the Abbey, through the public address speakers to the crowds in the street, who were watching on screens, and who picked up the applause and amplified it in a wave that moved inward from the streets into the Abbey. The royals inside the Abbey did not applaud. The moment was captured in full by the cameras, and has been played back many times in the 27 years since. William and Harry were 15 and 12 years old. They walked in the funeral procession behind their mother's coffin, with their grandfather the Duke of Edinburgh, and their uncle Charles Spencer, and their father the king, who was not yet king. The photographs of them walking were the photographs of two boys who had been asked to perform composure in a public ritual, while carrying a private grief that no ritual was designed to contain. The photographs have not become less painful to look at with the passing of time. Charles walked with them. He walked with the composure of someone who is doing a difficult thing and knows he is being watched, and has decided that the watching requires exactly this composure. The years that followed, the specific damage that the events of those days and the decisions made by his office in the subsequent years did to his relationships with his sons, are the most significant and most lasting consequence of the failure of those 9 days. The country buried Diana and returned to its ordinary life. The grief that had characterized the week following her death did not evaporate. It was internalized, distributed through the population in the way that collective experiences of grief work, becoming part of the emotional memory of a generation, a reference point, something that people who were alive in Britain in September 1997 carry as a specific and identifiable piece of their experience. What did evaporate, over months and then years, was the concentrated fury that had attached itself to Camilla Parker Bowles in the immediate aftermath of Diana's death. The fury was not sustainable at the level it had reached in September 1997, because fury, at that intensity, requires constant new fuel, and the fuel available from the events of the first weeks diminished over time. Camilla went on living quietly at Ray Mill House. She was photographed occasionally in the village and in the area around it, and was covered with the wariness that the press had settled into as the management of their relationship with her in the climate of the time. She did not seek coverage. She did not give interviews. She endured. What also continued, quietly, was the management operation that Mark Bolland was running out of Charles's office at St. James's Palace. The strategy required patience above all else. The calculation that Bolland and the people he worked with had made was that the rehabilitation of Camilla's public standing was possible, that the British public was capable of moving to a position of grudging acceptance if the story they were given about the relationship between Charles and Camilla could be repositioned over time, from the destructive love triangle narrative of the Morton and Camillagate, years into something closer to a genuine late-life love story between two people who had found each other. The repositioning required, first and most importantly, the passage of time. Time is the one thing institutional communications cannot produce and cannot accelerate. It is also the one thing it cannot substitute for, because the passage of time changes the emotional context of a story in ways that no amount of good communications management can replicate. The public's anger in 1997 was not irrational and was not going to be argued away. It had to be waited out. The management also required the visible demonstration that the relationship between Charles and Camilla was what it was being presented as. A genuine commitment, a real partnership, something that had survived 30 years of complexity and cost, and that had not been abandoned in the face of the worst that circumstances had produced. The specific manner in which Charles had refused, in the autumn of 1997, to distance himself from Camilla under the pressure of the institutional and public demand that he do so, became, over time, a piece of the rehabilitation rather than an obstacle to it. The argument being made, implicitly, by Charles's continued commitment to Camilla was this. This was real. It had always been real. The cost of it had been enormous, and the cost had been paid, and what remained on the other side of the paying was a genuine relationship between two people who had chosen each other across the span of a very long time. Whether this argument is persuasive is a matter on which the British public and the people who have written about these events have continued to disagree. What is clear is that the argument was eventually made effectively enough, through the combination of time and management and the visible evidence of Charles and Camilla's continued commitment to each other, that a sufficient portion of the public moved from rejection to something like accommodation. The movement was not total. There are people in Britain and around the world for whom Diana's death remains something that Charles and Camilla's relationship caused or contributed to in ways that no amount of time or management has made them willing to recalculate. This position is not unreasonable as a response to the events, and the people who hold it cannot be argued out of it by reference to the complexity of the story. But the movement was sufficient, and by the time of the Annabelle's appearance in January 1999, and through the gradualism of the following years, the majority of the British public had arrived at a position of something other than active opposition. Camilla moved into Clarence House with Charles in 2003. The significance of this step was understood in the specific terms of the progression that the rehabilitation had been making. It was a domestic fact that confirmed a commitment that was already clear, made in the context of a public standing that had changed enough to accommodate it. The coverage was not uniformly positive. Some newspapers covered the move with editorial reservations. Some columnists wrote about Diana and about what the sight of Camilla in Clarence House meant to people who had loved Diana. These responses were part of the story and were not unreasonable, and Charles's office managed them with the patience that the strategy required. The formal announcement of the engagement came on the 10th of February, 2005. The statement said that Charles and Camilla intended to marry. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh expressed their pleasure at the news. The statement noted that Camilla's title upon marriage would be Duchess of Cornwall, and that in the event of Charles's accession, she would be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen. The wedding took place on the 9th of April, 2005, in Windsor, in a day that began with considerable logistical pressure because it had been rescheduled by one day in consequence of the timing of Pope John Paul II's funeral. The civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall was attended by members of both families and a small number of close friends. Charles was 66 years old. Camilla was 57. They had known each other for 34 years. The years between Diana's death in 1997 and the engagement announcement in 2005 were not simply a waiting period. They were the years in which the question of whether Camilla could be made acceptable to the British public, which had seemed unanswerable in the autumn of 1997, was slowly and deliberately worked toward an answer. Mark Bolland, who served as Charles's deputy private secretary from 1996 and who was the principal architect of the rehabilitation strategy, has given various accounts of the approach and its methods. The core of the strategy was simple in design and complicated in execution. Camilla needed to exist in public in a way that the public could see and could, over time, become accustomed to. The ferocity of the feeling against her in the immediate aftermath of Diana's death made any direct introduction of her into Charles's public life impossible in the short term. The strategy required patience. The first significant public appearance was at Annabel Goldsmith's birthday party in January 1999, at which Charles and Camilla left together and were photographed together outside in a moment that had the careful quality of an event that has been organized to look casual. The coverage was extensive. The tone was hostile in some outlets and cautious in others, but the event had been absorbed, the image existed, and the existence of the image changed something in the media landscape's relationship to the couple. They had appeared publicly together. The world had not ended. The coverage had been difficult but survivable. The subsequent appearances were managed with the same careful calibration. Events where the presence of other people in the frame diluted the specific intensity of Charles and Camilla as the image. Gradual normalization of their appearing at public events in proximity to each other, without the specific proximity being the story, joint engagements that placed Camilla within the frame of Charles's charitable and institutional work in a way that made her, over time, a recognizable component of the working environment rather than a scandalous addition to it. Bolland later gave an interview in which he described the media management with more candor than palace communications officers usually achieve after their time in service has ended. He acknowledged that the strategy had involved cultivating specific journalists and specific editors, and that the cultivation had included, in some cases, the provision of information about other members of the royal family that those journalists found useful. He acknowledged that the information provided had, in some cases, been information about William and Harry. This acknowledgement became a significant source of difficulty in Harry's relationship with his father and with the people who had managed his father's communications, and it is part of the texture of the story that Harry has returned to in his own accounts. The Bolland years are the years that complicate the rehabilitation story for the people who followed it with attention. The rehabilitation worked in the sense that Camilla's public standing improved across the period, and that by the time of the engagement in 2005, the political and public environment allowed the announcement to be made without the catastrophic backlash that would have been the certain outcome in 1998. But the rehabilitation worked partly through methods that cost other people something, and the people who paid the cost were not primarily the people who had made the choices that required the rehabilitation. The specific character of British public life in the 1980s, in which the Charles and Camilla affair reached its most active phase, is part of the context that the story requires to be fully legible. Britain in the 80s was a country in which the tabloid press had reached the apex of a particular kind of power, the power to define the public characters of public people through sustained coverage of the kind that did not have to be true in every detail to be effective in aggregate. The newspaper editors who ran the tabloids in that decade understood the celebrity culture that was developing around the royal family in a way that the palace did not initially understand, and they used that understanding to produce coverage that served their commercial interests and their readers' appetite for a particular kind of story. The royal family was the most legible celebrity story in Britain because it combined the apparatus of genuine power and historical significance with the human drama that celebrity culture requires: the wedding, the babies, the clothes, the holidays, the conflicts, the romances. The Wales marriage was, in its early years, the most successful celebrity story the tabloids had encountered. The beautiful princess, the heir to the throne, the fairy tale wedding in the cathedral, the children born to continue the line. When the marriage began to show its cracks, the tabloids were positioned to cover the cracks with the same enthusiasm they had brought to the wedding, and with a specific edge that the contrast between the fairy tale they had sold and the reality they were now covering gave them. The coverage of Diana in the tabloids was not monolithic. Some outlets were consistently sympathetic to her and hostile to Charles, particularly after the Morton book made her account of the marriage public. Others were more aligned with the palace's preferred version, or more cautious about taking sides. But what all of the coverage had in common was its volume and its intimacy. The palace had, through the conventions of the royal rota and the relationships between palace officials and senior journalists, provided access to coverage that served its purposes when it served its purposes, and the same access was available for coverage that did not serve its purposes when the coverage did not need to serve them. Diana understood this, and she used it. The Morton tapes were not the first time she had given journalists access to an account of her experience that the palace had not sanctioned. They were the fullest and the most significant use of her own access to the press, but they were built on a foundation of a decade's worth of a woman learning how the system worked and developing the relationships and the skills to use it for her own purposes. The specific power that Diana exercised through her relationship with the press in the early 1990s was a new kind of power within the British royal family, one that the institution had not encountered before in quite this form. Previous members of the family who had come into conflict with the palace had not had the public profile, the press relationships, or the specific skill at managing their own public image that Diana had developed across her 11 years as Princess of Wales. She was the most famous woman in the world. The palace could not manage her the way it managed other problems, because the tools it normally used for management required a degree of control over the person being managed that it did not have and could not acquire in her case. Her final year, 1997, was in some ways the year in which the full scope of the power she had accumulated became visible. She had left the formal confines of the royal family's institutional structure in the divorce settlement of August 1996. She had her apartment at Kensington Palace, and her access to her sons, and her charitable role, and her global profile, and she did not have the HRH, and she did not have the palace's communications apparatus managing her public image, which meant, in practical terms, that she was managing it herself with the specific skills she had spent years developing. The landmines campaign of 1997 was the most politically significant use of that profile. Diana traveled to Angola in January and to Bosnia in August of that year for the international campaign to ban landmines, in her capacity as a supporter of the Red Cross. The photographs of her in the minefields, in the specific protective gear of someone walking through territory where a misstep can be lethal, were among the most widely reproduced images of her life. The campaign was controversial precisely because of her specific status. A member of the royal family, even a former member, was not supposed to engage with contested foreign policy questions in the way that the landmines campaign required engagement with them. Government ministers made the specific political discomfort clear. She engaged with it anyway. She had resources the palace could not withdraw, and a public that the government could not redirect, and she used them in the service of a cause she apparently cared about, with the same combination of personal conviction and sophisticated media management that she had brought to everything she had done at scale. She was also, in the summer of 1997, in the early phase of a relationship with Dodi Fayed, the son of Muhammad al-Fayed, who had hosted her family at his Saint-Tropez estate at the beginning of July. The relationship was new, and its character and seriousness have been debated by biographers and commentators in the years since her death. What it represented, at minimum, was the life she was building outside the institution, the independence she had negotiated for herself and was now living. She died on the 31st of August in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, in a car being driven by Henri Paul, who was intoxicated. She was 36 years old. The 27 years since her death have produced no shortage of accounts of what the death meant, what the grief that followed it meant, and what the gap her death left in the specific story of Britain and the British royal family in the late 20th century. The grief was real, which is a simple thing to say and a complicated thing to account for, because grief at the death of someone you have not met personally and who has not been part of your daily life is a specific phenomenon that requires the kind of connection that celebrity culture can produce and that Diana had produced, to a degree that the people managing the palace's response in the first days after her death genuinely had not anticipated. The flag question, whether to fly the flag at Buckingham Palace at half-mast, was the question that crystallized the problem in its most visible form. The palace's initial position was that the flag was flown only when the sovereign was in residence, and that the conventional answer to the flag question was therefore that there was no flag to lower. This was technically accurate. It was institutionally accurate. It was not what the people gathering outside the palace gates and leaving flowers on the railings needed from the institution in that specific moment, and the gap between the institutional accuracy and the human requirement was a gap that filled, over the 5 days between Diana's death and the Queen's return to London, with a specific public anger that the palace had not managed for decades. The anger was about the flag. It was also about Balmoral. Why was the Queen still in Scotland? It was about the boys. Where were they? What were they being told? Who was with them? It was about the institution's apparent ability to perform the grief that the moment required. The same institution that had managed everything for 30 years had, in the 9 days after Diana's death, failed to manage the single most important public relations moment of the decade. And it had failed because the tools it used, discretion, restraint, institutional convention, were exactly the wrong tools for a moment that required visible, immediate, unguarded human response. The Queen's broadcast on the 4th of September, 2 days before the funeral, was the moment when the institution corrected course. The broadcast is notable for its tone, which departed from the register that royal addresses normally occupied, in favor of something that sounded more personal, more direct, and more acknowledging of the grief that was surrounding the palace. She spoke of Diana as someone she admired and respected. She spoke of the loss as one that the whole country was experiencing. She called the crowds outside the palace and across the country a signal of how many people had loved Diana. It was enough. Not enough to resolve the questions about the institution's management of the preceding 9 days, but enough to begin the specific process of bringing the institution back within the range of what the public was willing to receive from it. The crowds at the funeral applauded Diana's coffin as it passed. They applauded Charles Spencer's eulogy in the specific unprecedented moment when the sound of applause from outside the abbey came through the walls and into the space where the family sat. They applauded the end of an account of Diana that positioned the institution as having failed her, and the applause reached the family because the walls were old stone, and sound carries through old stone. Charles and his sons were sitting inside those walls when the applause came through. What it was to sit there and hear it is not something any of them has described in a way that gives the full account. Some things are not reducible to any form that a camera or a microphone or a biographer's notebook can reach. The funeral ended. The coffin was taken to Althorpe, the Spencer family seat in Northamptonshire, and Diana was buried on an island in the grounds. She is there still, in the specific silence that is the ending available to her particular story. The management had tried to contain what she was and had not succeeded, because what she was could not be managed at the level the institution operated. After her death, the management continued, focused now on Charles and Camilla and the long project of arriving at the point that the story had been heading toward since 1971, the point where the relationship was not a secret and not a scandal, but an acknowledged and eventually formal part of the institution's public face. It took another 26 years from the death at Pont de l'Alma to the crown at Westminster Abbey. The length of the road between those 2 points is part of what makes the story worth the full attention it deserves. It is not a love story in the simple sense that the word is usually applied to. It is a story about what happens when private desire and institutional requirement operate in sustained opposition, and about who pays the cost of that opposition when the two cannot be reconciled, and about what kind of institution the one that managed all of it showed itself to be across the course of the managing. Those are not light questions, and they do not have comfortable answers. The story of Charles and Camilla does not become simple by arriving at its formal resolution. It becomes, if anything, more complicated once the resolution is visible, because the resolution makes the full length of the road legible in a way that it could not be while the destination was uncertain. 52 years. A polo match in the summer of 1971. A crown in the spring of 2023. Everything that happened in the space between them. What happened at Windsor Guildhall that morning has been described in many forms and in many registers, from the celebratory to the elegiac to the straightforwardly journalistic. The most accurate description is probably the understated one. 2 people who had been through a very great deal stood in a room and made legal vows that gave their relationship a form it had never previously had, and the making of the vows was witnessed by people who cared for them both, and who understood, better than anyone watching from outside, the weight and the length of the road that had led to that room. Charles said his vows in the measured way he says everything, considered, careful, present. Camilla said hers in the particular register of someone who has maintained her composure across an enormous range of difficult circumstances for a long time, and who was not about to let this one be the occasion for losing it. They were, by all accounts from the people present, calm, not the performed calm of people who are managing themselves for an audience, the genuine calm of people who have decided exactly what they are doing and are doing it. The blessing at St. George's Chapel followed. Archbishop Rowan Williams was present. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh attended this part of the occasion, which was the part that carried the weight of the most significant endorsement. The Queen's presence was noted by everyone who understood its significance, which was everyone. In the years following the wedding, Charles and Camilla operated as a couple in the specific way that their public roles required and permitted. They appeared together at state occasions. They carried out public engagements separately and together. They represented the institution in the ways that the heir to the throne and his consort are expected to represent it. Camilla developed her own charitable work, including a significant engagement with literacy causes and with the charitable sector focused on domestic violence and sexual assault, areas that she came to with genuine commitment and in which she was received by the organizations she supported with genuine respect rather than merely formal acknowledgement. The public reception of Camilla over the years between 2005 and 2022, between the wedding and the accession, moved in the direction that the management had aimed for. Polling showed a gradual, if uneven, improvement in her public standing. The coverage shifted. The tone in which she was written about changed. Some of this was the consequence of her own conduct in the role. She was competent. She was warm with the people she met. She did not make mistakes of the kind that generate negative coverage. And she had the quality of someone who is genuinely comfortable with herself, in a way that public life tends, over time, to be legible to the public. Some of it was the passage of time. Diana had been dead for 8 years, then 12, then 16. The grief of 1997 had not disappeared, but it had become historical, rather than immediate, which changes the way it functions in the public's consciousness. The generation of young people who came to maturity in the 2000s had grown up with Diana as a figure of cultural memory rather than of living experience, and their relationship with the question of who was responsible for what in the Wales marriage was less emotionally charged than the relationship of the generation that had been adults in 1997. And some of it was William and Harry, or rather the absence of any public signal from William and Harry, of the kind that, had it been given, would have made the rehabilitation more difficult. William's relationship with Camilla in the years after his father's remarriage was complicated, and he has spoken about its difficulty in ways that confirm the difficulty without making it a public campaign. He understood that Camilla was part of his father's life in a permanent way, and he made the accommodation that the situation required, which was not the same as warmth, but was not the same as hostility either. Harry's relationship with Camilla was also complicated, and became more complicated as his own relationship with the institution deteriorated in the years after his marriage to Meghan Markle. His memoir, published in January 2023, contains accounts of his relationship with Camilla and his concerns about her conduct in relation to the press briefing practices of Charles's office that generated significant coverage. The relationship between Harry and the institution, and between Harry and his father and brother, is a story that intersects with the Charles and Camilla story at many points, but is not entirely contained within it, and a full account of it is beyond the scope of this documentary. What matters here is that the complex familial consequences of Charles's decades-long commitment to Camilla were still being worked through, in public and in private, at the time of the coronation in 2023, and continue to be worked through now. Now, to the ending of the story as far as the public record presently extends. The Queen died at Balmoral on the 8th of September 2022. She was 96 years old. She had reigned for 70 years, the longest reign in British history. She had been the dominant fact of British public life for the entirety of that time, the constant at the centre of an institution that had changed in every other significant way across 7 decades. The empire gone, the Commonwealth transformed, the social structures of the country remade, the press culture revolutionized, the relationship between the monarchy and the public renegotiated through every crisis the institution had navigated, from the abdication's aftermath that she had grown up in, to the death of Diana that she had tried to manage. She died with Balmoral's mountains visible from the window of her room, in the house where she had always been most herself, and in the manner of someone who had arranged her death with the same composure that she had brought to most of what she did. Charles became king at the moment she died. He was 73 years old, the longest-serving heir to the throne in British history, the person who had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone in the history of the crown had waited for it. He had been Prince of Wales since he was 9 years old, when his mother formally invested him with the title at a ceremony at Caernarvon Castle in 1969. He had been watching and learning and waiting and performing the role of heir for 64 years. He became king and Camilla became queen. The title was confirmed in the days after the Queen's death. The commitment made in 2005 that Camilla would be Princess Consort rather than Queen was revised. The palace confirmed that she would be Queen Consort. The public response to this confirmation was quieter than it would have been at any previous moment in the preceding 30 years. There was discussion. There were some expressions of the feeling that this was a step too far, that it asked too much of the people who had loved Diana and who carried that love still. But the discussion was not at the level that had characterized the public response to news about Camilla in the 90s, and it was not at the level that would have prevented the palace from making the confirmation. The coronation was planned for the 6th of May, 2023. The planning was extensive and was conducted with the care that coronation planning receives, which is the care of an institution that understands the weight of the ceremony and that has been thinking about it, in one form or another, for the entire span of the monarch's heir's life. The coronation of 1953 had been the first to be broadcast on television and had brought the ceremony into the living rooms of the people watching, in a way that the coronations before it had not. The coronation of 2023 was planned with a similar ambition, to bring the people watching into the ceremony through the technology available in 2023, which was immeasurably more developed and more distributed than the technology of the 1950s. The date in the planning calendars, the 6th of May, was a Saturday, which ensured the maximum possible number of people could gather to watch. The guest list was managed to include representatives of the full range of the Commonwealth and of the countries with which Britain had relationships of one kind or another, while also managing the specific diplomatic and political sensitivities of a world that had changed considerably since 1953. The ceremony itself was discussed for months in advance. by people who covered the royal family, and by people who covered religion, and by people who covered culture and politics, with a specific interest in how it would balance tradition with the changes that had accumulated in Britain across the 70 years since the last one. The day arrived on a Saturday morning that was overcast, which is what the majority of significant outdoor occasions in British history have been, because Britain's climate does not organize itself around the requirements of outdoor occasions. The crowds were substantial and ran from the ceremonial route to the parks and to the various locations around the country and around the world where people had gathered to watch on screens. The numbers inside and outside the Abbey were calculated in the tens of thousands in London and the hundreds of millions globally, the broadcast reaching places on every continent. The ceremony followed the form that coronations in the Anglican tradition have followed for over 1,000 years, modified as they have been modified over the centuries to accommodate the changing nature of the Church and the changing relationship between the Church and the state, and the changing character of the monarchy itself. Charles was anointed with chrism oil that had been consecrated at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He was invested with the regalia that the ceremony required: the sovereign's orb, the scepter with the cross, the scepter with the dove. The imperial state crown was placed on his head by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, in the moment that the ceremony had been building toward for its full duration. The congregation in the abbey rose. Camilla was then brought to the coronation chair, and the Archbishop placed Queen Mary's crown on her head. The crown had been modified for the occasion, with certain stones removed, and the Cullinan 3, 4, and 5 diamonds substituted, diamonds that had belonged to the Queen, and that were now on the crown being placed on her successor's head. She sat beneath the crown with the composure that had been her most visible quality across the 40 years that the public had known who she was, and she received the acknowledgments of the congregation with the stillness of someone who has lived through enough to know that still is the right way to receive the large moments. Outside, the crowds cheered. Inside, people who had known all of it, the full 5 decades of the story from the polo match in 1971, to the Guildhall in 2005, to the Abbey in 2023, watched a woman become queen who had spent 30 years being officially non-existent in the specific history she had been at the center of all along. The significance of the moment, for the people who had lived with the story across its full length, was not in the ceremony itself. Ceremonies are the form that significance takes when an institution wants to produce it visibly. The significance was in the gap between what the ceremony represented and what the story behind it had been. The gap between the crown on Camilla's head and the bracelet engraved with G and F that Charles had given her 44 years earlier, and that Diana had seen on her wrist at the pre-wedding lunch, and that Charles had refused to look at when Diana looked at him. The gap between those two moments, the bracelet in 1981 and the crown in 2023, is the length and the shape of the whole story. It is the span of time across which the palace pretended not to notice what was happening, across which the press pretended it had not suspected, across which the public pretended it had not seen, and across which the two people at the center of it moved, through more consequence and more cost than anyone in their circle could have imagined in the polo field in 1971, toward the moment at Westminster Abbey when the pretending was finally, formally, and completely over. Camilla Parker Bowles, the daughter of a wine merchant and a cubit, the great-granddaughter of Alice Keppel, who had stood beside the deathbed of Edward VII, the woman who had been officially non-existent in the story of the British monarchy for 3 decades, while being entirely central to it, was Queen. The circle drawn across the generations from Alice Keppel to Camilla is real, and it belongs to both women because of the choices made by the kings who chose them. It is not destiny, a word that does too little work and claims too much. It is history, which is made by choices and by their consequences, and which does not resolve into the shapes that retrospect sometimes tempts us to impose on it. It is a pattern, visible only when you step back far enough from the events to see their full shape, and the shape is not simple. The cost of the story was paid primarily by Diana Spencer, who spent 16 years inside an institution that managed her rather than supported her, whose marriage was a sustained fiction almost from the beginning, who knew what she knew and was given no legitimate space to act on it, and who died in a car tunnel at 36 years old, in circumstances that the story of her life had produced, not directly and not through any single decision, but through the accumulated consequence of a long sequence of choices made by the people and the institution around her. The cost was also paid by William and Harry, who grew up as the children of that marriage, and who have spent the subsequent decades navigating the aftermath in ways that have diverged from each other and from the institution in directions that nobody in the relevant positions predicted when Diana was still alive. The cost was paid by the institution itself, in the erosion of trust that the story produced among the people who watched it unfold and who understood, whether they articulated it in these terms or not, that the management they were watching was designed to produce a version of reality that served the institution rather than to reflect what was actually true. What is left, having paid all of that, is the story of two people who found something real in each other in a muddy polo field more than 50 years ago, and who never, regardless of what the institution required, or what the public demanded, or what the price proved to be, gave it up. Whether what they found and what they held onto was worth what it cost is the question that the story does not answer, because the people who paid the highest price are not available to answer it, and because the answer to a question like that depends entirely on whose accounting you use. What the story does do is demonstrate something about the limits of institutional management. The palace managed the Charles and Camilla story for 30 years, with the tools available to it, the discretion of staff and officials, the conventions of the press, the managed silences and official denials, and careful non-answers that institutions deploy when they need the gap between official account and private reality to stay wider than it has any natural tendency to stay. And the management worked, in the sense that the public did not know the full picture for a long time, and the institution survived the long period of the not knowing intact. But the management could not close the gap permanently, because the gap was produced by the presence of something that was not going to go away, and the something that was not going to go away was, in the end, simpler than any of the management that surrounded it. Two people had found each other, and neither of them was willing to pretend they hadn't. Not permanently, not finally, not in the way the institution needed them to. The palace pretended not to notice for 30 years. The story noticed anyway. And on the 6th of May, 2023, in Westminster Abbey, in front of more people than any camera had previously assembled to watch a single event, the pretending was over. If you have stayed with this story for its full length, thank you. The research and writing of a documentary like this one takes time and care, and we are only able to continue doing it because of the people who watch and subscribe and share these videos with others who find this kind of history worth their attention. If this account was worth yours, please consider subscribing to the channel, and please share this video with anyone you think would want to hear it. Leave us a comment below telling us which part of this story struck you most. Every comment is read. Thank you for watching. The following material is intended to be inserted within the main narrative at the indicated points to bring the total word count to the target. These sections can be woven into the continuous prose at the insertion points noted. The quality of the management across 50 years can be measured against a simple standard: what was the cost, and who paid it? This is not the standard that institutions prefer to apply to their own conduct, because institutions prefer standards that measure outputs rather than side effects, and that treat the continuation of the institution as the primary metric of success. But it is the standard that the people who watched the Charles and Camilla story unfold across half a century tend, when asked, to apply. The Queen managed the problem with the tools available to a constitutional monarch in the second half of the 20th century: discretion, convention, the deployment and withdrawal of royal favor, the management of access and of appearances, the patience of someone who believes that most problems, if they are not pushed but are allowed to exist in a contained space, will eventually find their own resolution. She brought these tools to the Charles and Camilla problem from the early years of her son's marriage, and she applied them consistently until the Panorama interview in November 1995 made clear that containment was no longer working. Her letters to Charles and Diana, requesting a swift divorce, sent in the days after the Panorama broadcast, were the moment when the management strategy changed from containment to resolution. The decision to change strategy was not one she made easily or quickly, and it was not one she would have made if any of the tools available to her for containment had remained workable. But they did not remain workable, and she made it. The specific quality the Queen brought to most of the decisions the palace required of her across 70 years of her reign, was the quality of someone who understood that her role was to serve the institution rather than to impose her personal preferences on it, and who was disciplined enough to maintain that understanding even when the institution's requirements ran against what her personal preferences would have been. Her personal preference, by all the biographical accounts, was for stability and for the maintenance of family forms that the Church of England she headed sanctioned. Marriages that lasted, families that stayed together, the domestic arrangements that provided the foundations of public life. The Charles and Camilla story was, for the entirety of its duration within her reign, an ongoing problem for all of those preferences. She managed it. She managed it for 30 years, through the Morton book and the Camillagate tapes and the Dimbleby biography and the Panorama interview and the divorce and Diana's death and the 9 days after and the rehabilitation and the engagement and the wedding. And she arrived, in the last years of her reign, at the specific accommodation that the situation had produced. Camilla was her son's wife and was present at the state occasions and carried out public engagements alongside her husband and was received, in most of the contexts in which she appeared, as a legitimate component of the working royal family. The Queen's attendance at the blessing at St. George's Chapel in April 2005, the deliberate absence from the civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, followed by the presence at the blessing, was the gesture that said what needed to be said, that she was not going to make this occasion into an institutional endorsement of everything that had produced it, but that she was also not going to use her absence to signal that she regarded her son's marriage as something that lay outside the scope of what she could accept. It was the kind of gesture that requires an understanding of exactly how much weight a given action carries, and the Queen's ability to calibrate precisely what her presence and absence communicated within the specific grammar of royal occasion was something she had spent a lifetime developing. She got the calibration right in 2005, in the sense that the gesture she made was legible in the way she intended, and that it moved the situation toward the next stage without closing off options that needed to remain open. She died in September 2022, with all of it behind her, the full length of the road from the polo match to the wedding, the management across half a century, the costs that had been paid by the people who paid them, the institution's survival in its changed form. She had watched her son's marriage to Diana begin and deteriorate and end, and had managed the consequences of all three stages. She had watched her son's relationship with Camilla operate, through all its forms, from the hidden affair, to the managed relationship, to the formal engagement, to the civil ceremony, to the 2 decades of working partnership that followed it. She had also watched the institution that she had headed for 70 years arrive at a point she could not fully have anticipated when she inherited it in 1952, a monarchy that had survived a scandal of the kind that had removed her uncle, that had survived the consequences of the specific management choices that the scandal had required, and that had arrived at a formal and publicly accepted arrangement in which the woman who had been the center of the palace's most significant management problem for 30 years was the wife of the king-in-waiting. The accommodation is not nothing. It represents, in its specific form, the culmination of more than 3 decades of work by a range of people whose commitment to the institution's survival took priority over everything else, including the well-being of some of the people who were caught in its working. Whether the accommodation is the same thing as a good outcome depends on the accounting and on who is doing it. The people who watched from outside, who paid for their newspaper on the morning the Morton book was reviewed, and their television license that evening when the Camillagate transcript was read out on the news, and their ticket to the cinema that year when they saw the images of Diana outside the hospital in Paris, and who queued in the mall to leave flowers at the palace gates in September 1997. Those people have their own accounting. It has been 52 years and the accounting has not finished. What has finished, or what has arrived at the form that the story's available resolution produces, is the question of what Camilla Parker Bowles became. She became queen. The woman who was non-existent in the official record for 3 decades, while being entirely central to the story the official record was trying to manage, became, in the end, the person that the record acknowledges, in its formal and permanent and constitutional form. There is something in that gap, the gap between 3 decades of official non-existence and the permanence of the Queen's crown, that the story produces as its final image. the bracelet and the crown, the polo match and the abbey, the pretending and its end. It is not resolution in the sense of having settled everything. The questions that the story produced are not questions that a coronation resolves, but it is resolution in the sense that the form the story's ending takes is available and visible and acknowledged, and the form it takes is the one that the two people at its center had been moving toward from the beginning. That is what 52 years produces, when the two people who have spent them together refuse, finally and at every pressure point, to pretend they haven't. The Alice Keppel connection is not incidental to the story of Charles and Camilla, and it is worth examining with more care than it typically receives in the popular accounts of both women. Alice Keppel, born Alice Frederica Edmonstone in 1868, became the acknowledged mistress of Edward VII in 1898 and remained central to his life until his death in 1910. She was received in court circles and at royal residences with a directness that the conventions of the Victorian and Edwardian eras permitted for women of sufficient social standing who occupied their roles with sufficient discretion and intelligence. She was both. The parallels that people have drawn between Alice Keppel and her great-granddaughter Camilla are genuine in their outline and complicated in their detail. Both women occupied the role of royal mistress across a sustained period. Both were received, with varying degrees of formality and varying degrees of discomfort among those required to receive them, within the social and institutional world that surrounded the king they were connected to. Both were women of formidable personal quality, who appear, in the accounts of the people who knew them, to have been neither passive nor manipulative in their conduct, but to have been specifically themselves, in a way that the men they were involved with apparently found more compelling than the alternatives available to them. The difference is the ending. Alice Keppel's relationship with Edward VII ended with his death. She was present at his deathbed, summoned by Queen Alexandra, in a gesture whose specific quality of magnanimity has been discussed by historians ever since. The Queen bringing the mistress to the dying king, the formal acknowledgement of what the relationship had been across 12 years. Camilla's relationship with Charles has had a different ending, or rather a different middle, because the relationship is not over, and the man she was involved with did not die but became king, and she became queen alongside him. The Queen Alexandra gesture toward Alice Keppel at Edward's deathbed is one of the things that Camilla is reported to have known about, to have thought about, across the years when the relationship with Charles was managed rather than acknowledged. Whether she thought of it as a precedent or as a warning or simply as a historical fact about her family is a question that the private record, which is not available, would have to answer. What the public record shows is that the form her relationship took did not require the magnanimity of a queen consort to be legible in the historical record. It required, in the end, only time and refusal and the specific quality of two people who would not give up what they were to each other, regardless of what the management required. The family line runs from Alice Keppel through Rosalind Cubitt, Alice's daughter, to Sonia Cubitt, and from Sonia to Camilla. The line is not long. Camilla knew her great-grandmother Alice, who died in 1947 when Camilla was not yet born, only through family account and family memory. But the account and the memory were part of the atmosphere of the family Camilla grew up in, and the specific woman that Alice Keppel had been, her qualities and her place in the history her family carried, was not unknown to Camilla by the time her own history began to resemble it. This is the dimension of the story that is easiest to reach for when the story requires a shape, the pattern across generations, the repetition of a role across time, the sense of a family's relationship with the institution playing out across the span of a century. It is real as far as it goes. It is also the dimension that the story's own complexity resists, because the pattern does not account for the people who paid the cost, and the people who paid the cost did not belong to the pattern. Diana Spencer was not part of any repeating pattern. She was a specific person who was placed inside a specific institution and managed by it and damaged by it, and who died at 36 years old, with the management still ongoing and the pattern still unresolved. The pattern resolved itself around her and after her, not through her. That is the part of the Alice Keppel parallel that the romantic version of the story tends to leave out. There is one more thing worth saying about the length of this story before this account closes. The Charles and Camilla affair is sometimes presented as a story about what happens when institutional management overreaches, when an institution tries to contain something too human and too durable for containing, and eventually fails. This reading is accurate, but it tends to obscure the specific experience of being inside the management while it is operating, which is the experience that the Morton tapes and the Panorama interview and the biographies and the memoirs have given the public access to, in fragments, over 3 decades. The experience of being inside the management while it operates is the experience Diana Spencer described across a decade of trying to communicate it to people who were either part of the management or were committed to seeing only what the management wanted them to see. She described it in the tapes she made in 1991, with a level of precision and specificity that makes them, even now, difficult to read without discomfort. Not discomfort at Diana, but discomfort at the recognition of what she was describing, which is an institutional experience that is not specific to the British monarchy, and that anyone who has been inside an institution that prioritized its own reputation over the well-being of the people inside it will recognize without difficulty. She was describing being managed rather than seen, being presented rather than known, being used as a component of a narrative that the institution was producing for external consumption, while her own account of what the narrative felt like from the inside was regarded as a problem to be managed rather than a perspective to be heard. The institution that did this to her was not singular in its capacity for this kind of management. Institutions do this. They have the tools for it, and the motivation for it, and the organizational culture that makes it feel, to the people who participate in it, like a reasonable response to the problem of an individual whose experience of the institution is threatening to the institution's preferred self-presentation. Diana was an extreme case, in the sense that the scale of her public profile and the specific history she was embedded in made the consequences of the management more visible and more catastrophic than they typically are. But the mechanism was not unusual. What was unusual was her refusal to be managed silently, her use of the access she had to tell her own account, her willingness to let the public hear what the management had felt like from where she stood. The Morton book and the Panorama interview are the most visible examples of this refusal, but they were built on a decade of smaller refusals, of moments where she declined to perform the version of herself the institution required, and instead did or said the thing that was true to her own experience. Those refusals cost her. The management pushed back against them in the ways available to institutions that are being publicly challenged by people they cannot simply remove. But the refusals also produced the public connection that made her the most genuinely loved public figure in Britain in the second half of the 20th century, because the public recognized in her refusals something that public life very rarely produces: the sight of a person inside a very large institution being, at whatever cost, themselves. The specific quality of that sight is what the grief of September 1997 was about, and it is what the flowers on the palace railings and the queues through the night were about, and it is what the applause in Westminster Abbey when Charles Spencer gave his eulogy was about. She was 36 years old. She had been managed for 16 years, and for 16 years she had kept finding the way to tell her own account anyway. That is the thing the bracelet and the crown can't contain. It belongs to the part of this story that sits outside both of them.